Chapter 16 of Tombstone, an Iliad of the Southwest by Walter Noble Burns. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Dale Barkley. John Ringo cashes in. John Ringo was drunk. For 10 days he had been morosely, broodingly, tragically drunk. As straight as an Indian, he stalked about Tombstone streets, a tall, silent, somber figure, looking a little more like Hamlet than ever, his hollow black eyes clouded and melancholy. As a toper, he was not hilarious. No antic impulse moved him to shoot out the lights or indulge in whooping cowboy deviltries. The intellectual outlaw took his pleasures quietly. He played a little faro and a little poker, and of an evening dropped in at the Birdcage Opera House. But chiefly, he mellowed the acerbity of life by steeping himself in great quantities of pleasant liquors. He was in Tombstone frequently in these piping summer days of 1882. The Earps had been gone for months, and the old town gave him friendly welcome. Ringo's boon companions on this 10-day drinking bout were Buckskin Frank Leslie and Billy Claiborne. Buckskin Frank still tended bar at the Oriental. Like Ringo, he went on sprees which sometimes lasted a week or two. Claiborne was himself a fairly stiff tippler, but he had the elasticity of youth in his favor. Ringo was now 38, and Leslie 40. Hard drinking had begun to tell on both. Ringo's periods of hopeless despondency had grown upon him, and he frequently threatened suicide. Leslie was the same light-hearted desperado he had been in earlier days, but liquor now brought the devil in him close to the surface, and his drunken mood was murderous. On a blazing hot day in the latter part of July, John Ringo, with 2 bottles of whiskey in his pockets, rode out of Tombstone on a drunken trail to mysterious death. Buckskin Frank Leslie and Billy Claiborne followed him. The 3 met again at Antelope Springs, 9 miles from Tombstone, and continued their spree for 3 days in the saloon of Jack McCann, who formerly had kept the last chance between Tombstone and Charleston, and had saved Johnny Behind the Deuce from the lynchers. Next, the 3 Pottle companions went to Soldier Holes, and then to Myers Cinnega in Sulphur Springs Valley, where, in the Widow Patterson's boozing ken, they wound up their long orgy.
"Ringo drank like a crazy man the 2 days he was at my place," said Mrs. Patterson. "He was blind drunk both nights when he went to bed. Leslie was tapering off. He slyly threw much of his liquor on the floor, and I don't think he was so drunk as he pretended to be. Late on the last night of their stay I heard a noise in the kitchen. I found Ringo in his underclothes rummaging through the pantry shelves. 'Looking for whiskey,' he muttered. 'Must have whiskey.' He was twitching and shaking, and there was a wild look in his eyes. I thought he was on the verge of delirium tremens. After a few drinks next morning he seemed better and rode off alone, saying he was going to Galeyville."
Later in the morning, Bill Sanders passed Ringo near a chain of waterholes known as the Tanks, or the Last Water. Ringo looked at Sanders out of unseeing eyes and rode on in silence. 3 miles west, Sanders met Frank Leslie, also riding alone, and in Sanders' judgment showing no signs of intoxication. Claiborne was nowhere in sight. Leslie asked if Sanders had seen Ringo, and when Sanders replied that Ringo was only a few miles ahead, Leslie hurried on as if to overtake him. Sanders wondered at the time why this murderous desperado, whose reputation credited him with being able to kill a man to see him fall, should be following Ringo's trail. Where West Turkey Creek Canyon, sometimes known as Morse's Canyon, opens out into Sulphur Springs Valley, Coyote Smith's ranch house stood in open timber. On a steep bank 20 feet high that rose from the creek on the opposite side at some distance below the house grew a giant live oak of peculiar formation. From a short stump-like central stem rose slantingly 5 trunks, each of the thickness of an ordinary forest tree and green with leaves the year round. Close to the ground, and held in position by the 5 boles, a flat rock formed a seat in the cool, deep shade. Nearby ran the freight road between Tombstone and Morse's sawmill, 10 miles farther up the canyon in the Chiricahuas. This tree was known to all the lumber haulers on the trail. Beneath it, they were accustomed to eat their lunch at the noonday halts. Between 12 and 1 o'clock on the day that Bill Sanders met Ringo, Coyote Smith's wife heard a shot.
"Will must have killed a deer,"
Mrs. Smith remarked to her son Henry. Will Smith, her brother-in-law, working at a coal pit in the hills, had heard a deer blow in the woods the evening before, and had taken his rifle with him when he went to his work that morning. But Will Smith had not fired the shot. He came running to the house in alarm. "Thought it might be Indians," he said. "Maybe it was one of the Mormon Smith boys shooting into that covey of quail that's been using down the creek." That evening at milking time, Henry Smith drove the cows through the bottomland below the big live oak. Whistling a little tune, the youth had no suspicion that on the bank over his head the red sunset was shimmering on the face of a dead man. Jim Morgan, a teamster, passing by on the trail with a load of lumber near noon next day, found John Ringo dead. The outlaw was sitting on the flat rock in the forks of the live oak, his body leaning back against one of the 5 trunks of the tree, his head sunk on his breast. His 6-shooter, held in his right hand, had fallen into his lap and caught in his watch chain. 5 chambers of the cylinder were loaded. The hammer rested on the single empty shell. His rifle stood propped against the tree. His white felt hat, stained with blood, was on the ground at his feet. The silver watch in the breast pocket of his blue flannel shirt was still ticking. In his right temple was a bullet hole, and at the top of his head a great shattered wound where the ball had passed out. Brains were scattered over the tree trunks. Ringo's coat and boots were missing. Bound about his feet were portions of his undershirt, which he had torn into strips. Around his waist were 2 belts, one for cartridges for his rifle, and the other for cartridges for his 6-shooter. The latter was buckled on upside down, and all but 2 shells had fallen out of it. What had become of his horse was not apparent. All the circumstances seemed to indicate conclusively that, as he so often had threatened, Ringo had ended his troubled life while sunk in the despairing gloom of the nerve-shattered insanity that had followed his debauch. Jim Morgan, Theodore White, and Bill Knott, acting as a coroner's jury, decided his death was suicide, and a few hours after the body was found, Ringo was buried near the foot of the live oak. Ringo's horse, still saddled and with a broken piece of picket rope about its neck, was found a week later at Robert Cienega in Sulphur Springs Valley, 6 miles from the mouth of West Turkey Creek Canyon. Ringo's coat was tied in a roll at the back of the saddle, and on the pommel the bridle was hanging. Not far from the horse, one of Ringo's boots was discovered. The other was never found. In the inner breast pocket of the coat was a group photograph of 4 persons believed to be Ringo's father, mother, sister, and the sister's child. Coyote Smith's widow, who at the age of 83 still lives in the old homestead in the canyon, retains this photograph today. Ringo's watch and horse were turned over to Sheriff Behan in Tombstone. The watch was sent to Colonel Coleman Younger, Ringo's grandfather, at San Jose, California. Sheriff Behan learned that the horse had been stolen from a Mexican living in the Dragoons and restored it to its owner. It was reported several years later that one of Ringo's sisters had the body exhumed and shipped to California. This, according to the Coyote Smith family, is untrue. Ringo, they declare, still lies in his grave under the oak tree. Faith in an old superstition regarding the effects of delirium tremens led the mountain folks to believe Ringo had taken off his boots under the hallucination that there were snakes in them. It seemed more probable that, sick and exhausted, he had removed his boots and tied them to his saddle before stretching out on the ground for a nap. While he slept, his horse doubtless had been frightened, broken its rope, and galloped away. Awaking to find horse and boots gone and forced now to travel on foot, Ringo evidently had used the torn pieces of his undershirt to protect his feet against stones and cactus. The cartridge belt on, upside down, was evidence of Ringo's distracted state of mind. Soon after Ringo's death, a rumor became rife in Tombstone that Frank Leslie had murdered him. The story may have had its origin merely in Leslie's reputation as a heartless killer, or in the fact that Leslie followed Ringo out of town, or in a statement credited to Billy Claiborne, but it was believed that Leslie had boasted of the deed. Such braggadocio would have been very dangerous. Confessed murderers were going over the road to Yuma even in those lawless times. Old-timers can remember no such boasts. If Leslie ever said he killed Ringo, he must have made the statement in whispered confidence only to his closest friends. Leslie had no cause to kill Ringo as far as anyone knew. No one had ever heard of any quarrel between them. To all appearances, the 2 men were friends. The manner of Ringo's death seemed to preclude the possibility of Leslie's having killed him. It is certain Ringo met death while sitting in the forks of the tree. The spattered brains proved that beyond question. and the single empty chamber in Ringo's six-shooter seemed to prove that he had killed himself. But the story that Leslie murdered him remained definite and insistent. It passed into tradition, and most people in that country believe it implicitly today. Despite the evidence of suicide, Henry Smith and his mother, who were the first to see Ringo's body after Jim Morgan had discovered it, recall two details of the tragedy that are difficult to explain. "I found no traces of powder burns around the wound in Ringo's temple, though I looked carefully for them," said Henry Smith. "If Ringo had shot himself holding the muzzle of his gun against his head, the flesh around the wound would have been flame-burned and black with powder. Then the pieces of undershirt wrapped about Ringo's feet were as clean as if he had just removed the shirt from his body. There was no mud, hardly any dirt on them. There had been a hard early morning thunderstorm in the canyon on the day we heard the shot that killed Ringo. It had left the ground very muddy. If Ringo had walked any distance to the oak tree, the foot bandages would have been soaked and coated with mud. Bill Knott, my brother-in-law, who was on the coroner's jury and is still living, also declares the foot wrappings were clean and there were no powder burns around the wound. He says the verdict of suicide was returned as the easiest and quickest way out of the affair. The jurors didn't want to lose time in a long coroner's investigation." Mrs. Smith corroborated her son's story. "I've never believed Ringo committed suicide," said the venerable woman. Bill Sanders' story seemed to lend color to the theory that Leslie killed Ringo. The point in the trail where Sanders said he met Leslie riding hard to overtake Ringo was only 12 miles or so from where Ringo was found dead. However, only by an involved ratiocination can it be figured out how Leslie possibly could have killed Ringo. Leslie might have encountered Ringo just as Ringo had wrapped his feet in the fragments of undershirt. Leslie might have taken Ringo behind him on horseback to the oak tree, so the foot bandages would have remained free from mud or dirt. Once seated in the oak tree, Ringo might have fallen into a drunken stupor. Then Leslie might have killed him with Ringo's own six-shooter without holding the weapon close enough to leave powder burns. It seems ridiculous to imagine the tragedy occurred in this way, but before dismissing such a possible explanation as utterly absurd, it may be well to wait a while. Crimes are not always to be solved by logical deduction. Impossibilities have a queer way of changing into facts. "The widow Patterson," said Henry Smith, "was convinced that John Ringo's ghost haunted her home at Myers Cienega. She got so she wouldn't go in a dark room alone for fear of seeing Ringo. When she'd drive over to spend the night with my mother, she'd tell how she'd seen Ringo standing in some dark corner and looking at her out of his black eyes so sorrowfully she had to weep. Almost every night, she said, she heard Ringo rummaging among the shelves of her kitchen pantry, still looking for whiskey. When my mother would suggest rats, Widow Patterson would become indignant. 'Rats nothing,' she would say, 'it's John Ringo's ghost.' For years there have been stories in the canyon that Ringo's ghost was often seen under the live oak tree, where he was killed and where he lies buried. Some people are still afraid to pass the spot at night. Several lumber freighters driving for Morse's sawmill claimed to have seen Ringo walking up and down under the tree and shining like phosphorus in the dark. One said he had seen the ghost sitting in the forks of the tree in broad daylight. Bill Sanders owns the farm where Ringo is buried, and his home is not more than 50 yards from the grave. If the place were haunted, you'd think some of Sanders' folks would have seen the ghost, but they never have. Once, my father, driving home late at night, saw a white figure moving near the live oak. 'That's Ringo, sure,' he thought to himself, and his hair stood on end. But the ghost turned out to be a teamster called Curly, looking for his bell horse that had pulled up its picket pin and run off from camp. Curly was dressed in his white cotton drawers and undershirt. Coyote Smith once kept a saloon across West Turkey Creek from his ranch house. Following the trail over the Chiricahuas from Galeyville, Curly Bill and his outlaws used to stop there on their way to Tombstone and Charleston. 'When I was a boy,' said Henry Smith, 'I knew Curly Bill and Ringo, Joe Hill, Bill Leonard, Jim Crane, the Clantons, McLowrys, and all the rest. They used to drink and gamble in my father's place for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. I've seen Frank Leslie with them more times than I can tell. As jolly a fellow as I ever saw was Buckskin Frank, forever singing songs and keeping everybody laughing with his funny stories. Shooting at flies on the wall to show their marksmanship was a favorite pastime with these fellows, and the lizard that sunned itself on a windowsill or the mouse that stuck its nose out of a hole was taking long chances. The walls looked like sieves, they were peppered so full of bullet holes. A rough bunch, but good-hearted, and they spent their money free as water. Many a wild carouse John Ringo had within 100 yards of where he sleeps today. John Ringo's grave is within the circle of the deep noonday shadow of the dark-leafed giant live oak in whose 5-stemmed forks he died. Few travelers ever see it now. Few people beyond a radius of a dozen miles know where it is. The canyon trail, once crowded with wagon trains creaking beneath loads of lumber, is almost obliterated. Morse's sawmill is gone. Only a chance horseman rides over the mountains from the San Simon on the old road the outlaws used to take from Galeyville. Far across the shimmering, sunny reaches of Sulphur Springs Valley, the dragoons are like a ribbon of amethyst in the west. Against the eastern sky loom the blue and shadowy Chiricahuas. The wide mouth of West Turkey Creek Canyon is like a wooded grass-green park. The air holds the sweetness of juniper and pine. A woodpecker tapping on a dead sycamore by the creek makes a hollow, booming sound in the deep silence. Lonely and still and peaceful is the spot where the outlaw lies. The flat-topped mound of large, loose rocks that marks Ringo's grave is 12 feet long, 4 feet wide, and as high as a man's thigh. The stones, obtained from the creek that flows with a soft, plashing murmur at the foot of the embankment, are water-worn and smooth and in color, brown and gray. No earth or cement holds them in place. The least among them is of a weight of 4 or 5 pounds, and a huge boulder unmarked by inscription of any sort is built into the head of the mound. Deeply impressive is this crude, lonely tomb without name or epitaph. It suggests, in its immense size, the cairn of some old giant of a lost heroic age. After all, that may be what he was, this strong man who flung away his life, but through pillage and maraudings and robber adventures, preserved something of the honor of his youth, this outlaw fighter with the courage and chivalry of a knight of old, who here in this sepulchre of iron rocks sleeps forgotten in the morning shadows of the Chiricahuas. Billy Claiborne was a Texas cowboy who had come to the Tombstone country with John Slaughter when that pioneer cattleman drove his first herd from the Panhandle into the San Pedro Valley. In his early days in Arizona, Billy was a rollicking, good-natured fellow, but a steady, hard-working, dependable ranch hand. Unfortunately for him, John Slaughter's ranch was only a short distance from Charleston, and Billy was soon snared in the whirlpool of that wild town's fascinations. Every payday found him drinking and gambling in Charleston saloons. There he fell in with the Clantons and McLowrys, who were John Slaughter's neighbors, and was soon hobnobbing with Curly Bill and all the outlaws who rode with that redoubtable leader. One of these, it may have been Curly Bill himself, began to call him Billy the Kid. To be known by the name of the famous New Mexican desperado was unction to Billy Claiborne's soul, and he became ambitious to justify the pseudonym and develop into a full-fledged bad man. When he killed a man in Charleston over a card game, he seemed on the high road to all the sinister glories of a desperado's career. He had won a reputation as a killer. He was looked upon thereafter as dangerous and quick on the trigger, and fraternized on terms of equality with all the bad men of the country. Though, as far as was known, he took no part in Curly Bill's raids and robberies, he was a familiar figure in all the outlaw haunts. John Ringo early won his admiration and became his particular friend. After Ringo's death, Claiborne went to Globe and found work in a smelter. "While knocking about Globe with some companions," said William Lutley, now one of Tombstone's leading citizens, "we ran into Billy Claiborne and asked him what he was doing there. 'I'm working double shift in the smelter,' he answered, 'to get enough money to go to Tombstone and kill Frank Leslie.' We were dumbfounded at this statement. We asked him what Leslie had ever done to him, and why he intended killing him. 'Never done nothing to me personal,' Claiborne responded, 'but I aim to kill him for murdering John Ringo.' The story that Leslie had killed Ringo was not news to us. We had all heard it, but we felt a little like laughing at Claiborne's seriousness. He was a pretty tough young fellow, but the job he had picked out for himself struck us as a pretty big one for him to tackle. As bad men, Claiborne and Leslie were not in the same class. Leslie was a professional, Claiborne an amateur. We knew that in a fair fight, Claiborne would have no more show against Leslie than a puppy dog pitted against a gray wolf. 'Look here, Billy,' one of my companions said, 'you just quietly forget that little plan and keep on working in the smelter. Leslie's killed about a dozen men. He's a sure enough desperado, a dead shot, and the quickest man with a gun in Tombstone. You leave him alone. If you go fooling around Leslie, you'll only get yourself killed.' But Claiborne wouldn't listen to us. He was bound he was going to kill Leslie, and that's all there was to it. He and Leslie had been drunk so often together that I suppose this familiarity had bred in Claiborne a contempt for Leslie. Claiborne evidently thought that, as a killer, Buckskin Frank was overrated. Claiborne arrived in Tombstone on his mission of vengeance on November 19th, 1882. The first thing he did was to get drunk. Foolish fellow. If ever he needed a clear brain and steady nerves, he needed them now. A loaded man is hopeless against a loaded six-shooter. When Nemesis staggers, it is safe to copper vengeance and play the bet to lose. Frank Leslie was standing on the outside of the bar in the Oriental Saloon, talking with a group of men, when in reeled Billy Claiborne. Fingering their glasses idly, the men at the bar looked at him without interest. They did not know him. But Claiborne shouldered in among them, and with much profanity began to spout blatant incoherencies. Leslie caught him by the arm and led him aside. "Here, Billy, this won't do," said Leslie in friendly wise. "These people are friends among themselves and are having a quiet drink. You are a stranger to them, and you've got no business butting in like this. You go on down the street. You're drunk." Claiborne went out, but soon came wandering back. "You insulted me a while ago, Frank Leslie," he shouted. "You can't treat me like that." Leslie took him by the coat collar and hustled him into the street. In a little while, Claiborne, armed with a Winchester, was standing at the corner of 5th and Allen Streets, just outside the front door of the Oriental. A little crowd gathered. With drunken, noisy bluster, Claiborne was proclaiming that he would have Frank Leslie's life. Leslie had gone on watch as bartender. He was drawing beer and mixing drinks. A friend rushed in excitedly and told him Claiborne was outside, threatening to kill him. Leslie went on quietly serving customers. Another friend dashed in with the same information. "Ho-hum," said Leslie in a tired sort of way. "Billy and I have always been good friends. I guess I'll have to go out and see what's the matter with the boy." Leslie took a six-shooter from a drawer and stepped into 5th Street through a side door. Claiborne stood swaying beside Nick Noble's fruit stand on the corner, his rifle across his arm. Leslie walked to within 10 paces of him before Claiborne saw him. "I don't want to kill you, Billy," said Leslie, his gun cocked in his hand. Claiborne threw his rifle to his shoulder without a word. Both men fired at almost the same instant. Claiborne's bullet tore a hole in the board sidewalk at Leslie's feet. Leslie's struck Claiborne in the breast near the heart. Leslie cocked his six-shooter again, but he did not fire a second time. "Don't shoot any more," Claiborne called out as he fell across the fruit stand. "I'm killed." Leslie went back into the Oriental, tied on his white bartender's apron, and again took his place behind the bar. "What'll be yours?" he asked a customer cheerfully. "A dry martini?" He mixed the cocktail deftly, strained it off into a glass, and dropped an olive in. Claiborne, mortally wounded, was removed to a hospital. Poor Billy Claiborne had made a mess of the tragedy he had so carefully planned, and had blundered stupidly from first to last. If he had had a sense of good theater, he would have told Leslie why he purposed to kill him. Unless the victim knows why he is about to die, vengeance is robbed of its sweetness. By all rules of the stage, Claiborne should have thundered, "Frank Leslie, you murdered my friend John Ringo, and I have come to avenge his death in your blood," or something like that. But Leslie knew nothing of Claiborne's true motive until afterward, and Tombstone was left to suppose the shooting was merely the result of a drunken row. Certainly Billy Claiborne had no flair for play-acting. As an avenger, he was an unheroic and undramatic fiasco. Some of his cowboy friends gathered about Claiborne's hospital cot to watch his last moments. For a half-hour he screamed curses on Leslie. Exhausted, finally, he sank back upon the pillow and calmly awaited the end. "Frank Leslie," he said quietly with his dying breath, "murdered John Ringo. I helped him carry Ringo in there, and seen him do it." Those were Claiborne's last words, according to his cowboy friends, who repeated them to Henry Smith. Their meaning was not entirely clear, but they threw a new light on the mystery of Ringo's death. When he made the statement, Claiborne, it may be added, fully realized that in the next minute he would be dead. All the evidence in the Ringo case has now been heard. Physical facts, as the lawyers say, pointing conclusively to suicide. An 11th-hour witness declaring with his dying breath he saw him murdered. One, of course, may suspect, if one cares to, that Claiborne's statement was a last desperate, revengeful effort to injure the man he had failed to kill. But one must remember also that men, consciously dying, rarely lie. So the matter awaits the verdict. How did John Ringo die? Suicide or murder? Which? Leslie was acquitted of the Claiborne killing and remained in Tombstone until 1890. Then he went to Yuma, where he lived in retirement and stripes. The tragedy that ended his Tombstone career occurred at Leslie's ranch in the Swisshelms. Leslie, Jim Hughes, and Diamond Annie, Leslie's latest flame, a pretty woman of Tombstone's red lights, were drinking at the ranch when their supply of whiskey ran out. Leaving Hughes and the woman alone, Leslie rode across country to the nearest groggery for more liquor. Upon his return, after nightfall, he flared into a jealous rage and killed Diamond Annie and shot Hughes through the breast. After lying hidden for several hours in deep Sacaton grass, Hughes made his way to Bill Reynolds' ranch, 2 miles distant. Next morning, Leslie knocked at Reynolds' door. It was believed he meant to kill the evidence of the murder by killing Hughes. Reynolds told him Hughes was not there. Behind the door at that moment, and within 3 feet of Leslie, Hughes was standing with a double-barreled shotgun. When Leslie rode into Tombstone, he said Hughes had killed Diamond Annie and escaped. After Hughes had told the true story of the affair, Leslie confessed and was sentenced to 25 years in Yuma Penitentiary. He was pardoned after serving 4 years. J. H. Macia of Tombstone met him in Tucson, and as Leslie was out of funds, Macia shared his room with him. "The old superstition that 13 is an unlucky number hasn't worked out in my case," Leslie remarked to Macia. "I killed 13 men and never once saw the inside of a prison. It was my 14th that caused all my trouble. But," he added with a whimsical shrug, "my 14th was a woman." Tombstone saw Buckskin Frank for the last time when, soon after his release from prison, he passed through town accompanied by Professor Dumble, geologist of the Southern Pacific Railroad, on the way to coal mines being developed by the railroad company in Mexico. A story came back that while Leslie was employed as wagon boss at the mines, he killed 3 Mexicans whom he had caught stealing wood. He was next heard of in San Francisco. There, it was reported, he married a woman who had become interested in him while he was in the penitentiary, and who is credited with being instrumental in obtaining his pardon. It is known that he was in Alaska during the Klondike gold excitement. Upon Leslie's return from the north, Jeff Milton of Fairbank met him in San Francisco. Leslie was prosperous then, and was living at the Russ House. The next 25 years are a blank in Buckskin Frank's story. Tombstone had no word of him. What devious roads he traveled, what adventures befell him during this last quarter of a century, remain secrets of the gods. A little old man, looking as if he might have seen rough experience on the cross ties, wrinkled, gray, and threadbare, walked into a billiard hall in Oakland one day in 1924, and asked in a quavering voice for some kind of light employment. His hard gray eyes were bright, his movements were touched with cat-like furtiveness, and there was a suggestion of steel-wire toughness in his wizened body. But he was a pathetic figure of old age, hungry, penniless, homeless, and down and out. Out of pity, the proprietor gave him a job dusting off the tables and racking the pool balls, and permitted him to sleep at night on a cot in a corner of the place. For several weeks the old codger went about his duties, and a sprightly, queer little elf he seemed to be, as gay and light-hearted as you please, full of wisecracks and drolleries and ready witticisms. Then, one morning, when the house was opened for business, he was gone. Gone, too, was a revolver stolen from a desk in the office, and the proprietor wondered with vague alarm what this ancient person, apparently well past 80, might possibly have wanted with that gun. The old man, by his own admission, was all that was left of the famous Frank Leslie, once of Tombstone. This was the last that was ever heard of him. Buckskin Frank, enigmatic man of many murders, had deteriorated into a shabby nobody and faded silently into the misty grayness of nowhere. End of Chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Tombstone, an Iliad of the Southwest by Walter Noble Burns. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Dale Barkley. Buried treasure. Ho for buried treasure. Throw the saddles on the ponies. Slap the blanket rolls and the grub and the old camp kid on the pack mule. Be sure of plenty of bacon and frijoles. And don't forget the picks and shovels. There before you runs the trail. Out yonder across the desert, a fortune of $3 million is waiting for you. All you have to do is find it. Get your directions right and keep them dark. Don't confide them to your best friend. The danger is that your friend may smile in your face with great show of incredulity, and then hurry off and dig up the treasure before you get there. That is sometimes the way with friends. A dying outlaw who helped bury the treasure wrote out in detail the directions for finding it. That should mean smooth sailing for you. He certainly should have known all about it. He also drew a map, now faded and yellow with age. But never mind the map. The directions will do, and here they are. Go first to Davis Mountain. Davis Mountain is the key to the whole secret of the treasure. Once there, the hidden riches will be yours. But if you miss Davis Mountain, you might just as well have stayed at home. That you may not, by any possible accident, mistake Davis Mountain for any other peak, keep your eyes open for a rounded, bald granite dome, visible for miles across rolling plains that run from it to the east. From the summit, with a good pair of field glasses, you can see over a good-sized slice of New Mexico. The old sugar loaf stands boldly up against the sky, and you should be able to identify it at the first glance. When you arrive at Davis Mountain, head west. A mile or a mile and a half due west, you will find a canyon. The east wall of this canyon is formed by wooded hills. The west wall is sheer rock precipice. A creek flowing through the canyon plunges over a ledge in a small cataract about 10 feet high. Bubbling from the bottom of the west wall is Silver Spring in the shade of a tall juniper tree. At the foot of this tree is a grave marked by slabs of stone at head and foot. This is the grave of an outlaw. $500 in gold is buried in a tin can at the head of it, but let that go for the present. Up the canyon and south of Silver Spring, at a distance of exactly 1 mile and 3/10, is Gum Spring. Between these two springs somewhere, and you may have trouble here as the canyon floor is overgrown with brush, lie scattered in the grass the remains of a burned wagon. Probably all the charred woodwork has rotted away by now, but the rusty old iron felloe rims, axes, springs, and hubs, slightly embedded perhaps in the soil, should be there yet. From Silver Spring to Gum Spring, the west wall of the canyon curves inward to form a shallow cove. At the deepest point of this concave space, and a little out from the wall, 3 feet or such a matter, stands a slender stone, which, as it will doubtless strike you at once, resembles a small obelisk. As a detail, it may be added that this stone is 3 feet high, squarely shaped, and 1 foot thick. On the east face of this rock pillar, carved deeply as with a chisel, are 2 crosses, one above the other, and standing out clearly to the eye. When you locate this rock of the 2 crosses, you may regard the 3 million as all but in your pocket. Now, at this rock, face Davis Mountain and step 20 paces east. You will find yourself at a point on a straight north and south line between Silver Spring and Gum Spring, and you will notice the wreckage of the burned wagon just in front of you. Stop right here. This is the spot. You will be standing directly above the buried riches. All you see just as clear as daylight. Buried here in the Davis Mountain Canyon, according to the story, is the pillage of many robberies in old Mexico in the southwest. A cigar box full of diamonds that were stolen from the vaults of a bank in Monterey and that once glittered on the dusky beauties of that rich old city beyond the Rio Grande. 2 statuary figures of pure gold, one of the Savior and the other of the Virgin Mary, that once occupied sanctuary niches in the great cathedral at Matamoros. Sacks of gold and silver money. 39 bars of solid gold bullion, and several rawhide aparejos containing 90,000 Mexican dollars captured in an attack on a smuggler train in Skeleton Canyon. The value of $3 million placed on the treasure was the estimate of the dying outlaw, who was supposed to have taken part in the robberies and the burial of the loot. It took a 4-horse team, according to this freebooter, to haul the treasure to its secret hiding place. Anyone who ever happens to unearth the treasure need not be surprised to find a few feet below the surface a skull and white, moldering human bones. This will be the skeleton of a Mexican whom the outlaws hired, on promise of a rich share, to freight the treasure in, and who was murdered and buried with it when his labor was completed. In this the robbers followed the best tradition of the old buccaneering sea rovers, who buried their gold on lonely tropical islands, the dead man's lips being sealed upon the secret of the treasure, and his ghost forever after keeping watch and ward above it. Down in Sonora, a smuggler train was making ready to start for Tucson with what may have been the richest cargo ever to cross the international line. Great secrecy had been observed. Since Curly Bill's massacre of the smugglers in Skeleton Canyon, the Mexicans had grown wary. But while preparations for the journey were being made, a swarthy fellow fluent in Spanish, boisterously friendly and with money to spend, was busily hobnobbing and drinking with the smugglers. This was Jim Hughes. A veteran of Curly Bill's robber expeditions, Hughes was a sly, intriguing man, adept in treacheries, but as bold as he was cunning. A half-breed Mexican himself, his crossed blood made him particularly useful to Curly Bill in scouting out news of the smuggler trains coming north across the border. Acting now as a spy for the San Simon outlaws, Hughes was looked upon by these men of Sonora as a Mexican, an impression that he helped along by scathing denunciations of the whole breed of gringos. He was soon in the confidence of the smugglers, and over the tequila in the cantinas had little difficulty in worming from them all their plans. The smugglers were to follow the old trail through Skeleton Canyon. They were to market gold bullion in Tucson. The pack-sacks of their mules were to be loaded with Dobie dollars on one side and an equal weight of bar gold on the other. This information set the spy's heart thumping. When the smuggler train set out on the trail, Jim Hughes, far ahead, was riding hard for the San Simon. When Hughes arrived in Galeyville, Curly Bill was in Charleston. No time was left to report to the outlaw chieftain, and Hughes determined to enrich himself by a coup of his own. Hastily assembling a small band of outlaws, he headed for Skeleton Canyon. Where the canyon opens into the San Simon Valley, he placed his men in ambush in the mesquite along the low canyon wall. Who the men with Hughes were has been a matter of dispute. Milt Hicks and Jack McKenzie, certainly. Zwing Hunt and Billy Grounds, possibly. Ike and Billy Clanton, probably. There was one other whose identity is not known. The question of the presence of Zwing Hunt and Billy Grounds had an important bearing on the story, later to evolve, of buried treasure at Davis Mountain. Down through Skeleton Canyon, over the Peloncillo Mountains, came the Mexican smuggler train, mule bells jingling in the morning sunlight. A half-mile from the mouth of the canyon and an equal distance below the Devil's Kitchen, the scene of Curly Bill's murderous exploit of a month before, the 15 Mexicans halted for lunch. While their coffee simmered on a little campfire and they sat eating on the grass, the canyon wall above them flamed with crashing rifles. 3 Mexicans fell dead. Panic seized the others. They sprang on their ponies. Down the canyon they galloped in the midst of a mad welter of pack mules, stampeding with wildly jangling bells. 3 more Mexicans were killed, it is said, before the smugglers went racing out of the mouth of the canyon and escaped across the San Simon Valley. Zwing Hunt, it is said, was struck in the shoulder and brought down by a bullet fired by the Mexicans in their flight. Also, it is said, Billy Grounds carried his wounded comrade to an oak tree at the canyon's mouth and laid him on the ground in the shade. There, it is said, Billy Grounds dressed the wound after bathing it with water fetched from the creek in his hat. It is a pretty story, and it gave the tree, which stands now in Ross Sloane's corral, the name of the Outlaw's Oak. The Mexicans routed, Jim Hughes and his men mounted their ponies and went helter-skelter in pursuit of the pack mules to kill them and save the treasure. The terror-stricken mules had rushed out of the canyon and were running in every direction across the San Simon. Lumbering under their heavy loads of silver money and gold bullion, the animals, one by one, were soon overtaken and shot. Only 1 mule escaped. What to do with the ponderous treasure that had fallen into their hands became the problem of the outlaws. It was plainly impossible for 6 or 8 men to carry it away on their ponies. They decided to cache it, it is said, and leave it until such time as they could return for it with a wagon. The dead mules lay here and there over a wide area, some a mile apart. It was slow work to rifle the aparejos and carry the money and gold bars into the canyon. But the job was completed at last, and the spoils of the fight, it is declared, were buried under a group of 3 live oaks near the mouth of the canyon. The value of the loot of this robbery has been variously estimated. The Mexican money stolen, according to one story, amounted to $90,000, and the gold bars numbered 39. The treasure was lifted by the outlaws within the next few days, it is supposed, and under the guidance of Zwing Hunt and Billy Grounds, hauled in a 4-horse wagon driven by a Mexican to the Davis Mountain Canyon and reburied in a pit already half filled with robber loot brought by Zwing Hunt and Billy Grounds out of Mexico. The Mexican teamster, it is said, was murdered and the wagon burned. Whatever may be confused or uncertain in this Skeleton Canyon story, it is a fact that skeletons of the dead mules lie about the San Simon Valley, near the canyon's mouth, even now, and the rawhide aparejos are still found here and there, rotted by the rains and suns of years. Certain, too, it is that, for many years after the fight, Mexican silver dollars, scattered broadcast by the runaway mules, were picked up all over the country. Cowboys at the San Simon Ranch played poker all the next winter with the money they found in the Skeleton Canyon neighborhood. Every now and then, even today, these tarnished old silver pieces are discovered, and only a little while ago Mr. Joseph Wheeler, wealthy cattleman whose ranch is within a few miles of the canyon, found 6 coins that are relics of the attack on the smuggler train nearly a half-century ago. A mysterious old German appeared in Skeleton Canyon early in the 90s. He built a little hut at the forks above the Devil's Kitchen, and for 2 years lived alone in his wilderness hermitage. Who he was, or even his name, never was learned, and he is known in the buried treasure tradition only as the Old Dutchman. But the Old Dutchman was a busy fellow, and he was forever digging holes. There was little travel through Skeleton in those days, and few people ever saw him. But an occasional cowboy, combing the hills for cattle during a roundup, would stop and talk with the Old Dutchman, smoking his pipe beside his cabin door. From stray hints dropped in these infrequent conversations with cowboys grew a story that the Old Dutchman had been with Jim Hughes in the attack on the smuggler train, and since that day had served 10 years in some penitentiary. Now, as it was supposed, having recently regained his freedom, he had come back to find the treasure buried by the outlaws. If the Old Dutchman was with Hughes, he should have known, of course, the spot at which the plunder of the robbery had been cached. But evidently he did not know, or he would not have spent 2 years hunting for it. But at any rate, one day the Old Dutchman was gone. He had vanished into the mystery out of which he had come, and nothing more has been heard of him from that day to this. But a half-mile below the Devil's Kitchen, under a group of 3 live oaks on the bank of the creek, he had left a deep hole, the deepest and largest of all the holes ever dug by treasure hunters in the canyon, and many believed that in this excavation he had at last found the treasure. The ruins of the Old Dutchman's cabin still stand at the forks of the canyon. The scars of his industry with pick and shovel still pit the ground, and the last hole he dug is still wide and deep. But whether he lifted any treasure is a riddle that remains unanswered. Though it seems fairly certain that the outlaws themselves removed all their booty from Skeleton Canyon, the story persists that they had left at least part of it behind. Wherefore, treasure hunters without end swarmed for years to the canyon. Some were equipped with divining rods. Some placed their faith in the magic of willow wands. Some had taken counsel of old Mexican cronies who claimed the power of second sight. Some had consulted Indian witch doctors. Others still had learned the exact spot at which the treasure could be found from spirit mediums who declared they had received the information direct from the ghosts of the Mexicans murdered in the canyon by the outlaws. But if any of these industrious delvers ever came away from Skeleton with anything more than sore muscles from unwonted work with pick and shovel, no one ever heard of it. Porter McDonald, long chief of police of Tombstone, aided and abetted in the enterprise by James T. Kingsbury, Tombstone lawyer, received from a secret source several years ago information that he deemed worth investigating. He was led to believe that the treasure was buried on a ledge of the canyon wall within sight of the great hole dug by the Old Dutchman. On his prospecting trip to the canyon, however, he found no more than the others, but he was convinced that a violent earthquake that shook all that part of Arizona in 1886 had hopelessly entombed the hiding place of the treasure under tons of rocks toppled from the canyon wall. Davis Mountain, far-off peak of purple mystery, begins now to loom imposingly through the haze of this buried treasure romance. But before the story starts off on the trail for this rounded, bald granite sugarloaf, a murdered man must rise from the dead. Zwing Hunt, dangerously shot in the Stockton Ranch fight in which Billy Grounds was killed, escaped, it will be remembered, from a Tombstone hospital, and a little later, Hugh Hunt, his brother, reported his death by Indians. The body was identified by men who had known him, and some dead man is sleeping today in a lonely Arizona canyon with a juniper tree for headstone on which is carved Zwing Hunt's name. But Zwing Hunt, risen in marvelous resurrection, appeared in his proper person a few weeks afterward, according to his uncle, at his old home in San Antonio. He lived, it is said, only a short time after his return, and died from the old wound he had received in the fight at the Stockton Ranch. But he lived long enough, apparently, to set going the strange story of Davis Mountain and its buried outlaw gold. When Zwing Hunt was about to die, he telegraphed, it is said, to his uncle, who lived in some other part of Texas, to come to him. His uncle, whose name has not survived in the tale, arrived. "We came out of Mexico with 2 4-horse wagons loaded with plunder." This is Zwing Hunt's deathbed story, as related by his uncle. "Our raid had lasted 3 months. We numbered 29 men when we went in. Only 18 of us got out alive. In Monterey, while Billy Grounds and I sat on our horses shooting up and down the street, our partners robbed the bank. They brought out 2 gunny sacks filled with money and a cigar box full of diamonds. We took possession of Matamoros and sacked the town. From the cathedral there we brought away statues of the Virgin Mary and the Savior. These figures are life-size and of pure gold. When we got back on this side of the Rio Grande, we got rid of some of our loot. The rest we hauled to Davis Mountain. One of our men who had been shot in Mexico died at Davis Mountain, and we buried him by Silver Spring. $500 in gold had fallen to his share. He had risked his life for that money, and at last he gave his life for it. We decided to let him keep it forever, and we buried the dead man's money in a tin can at the head of the grave." When he had finished his story, Hunt, it is said, wrote out instructions as to how the treasure could be found. Then he drew a map on a piece of writing paper, and on this map he set down in their relative positions Davis Mountain, Silver Spring, Gum Spring, the wreck of the burned wagon, the rock of the 2 crosses, and the spot at which the treasure was buried. This old map is still in existence, and several copies of it are owned in Arizona. Hunt, as his uncle declared, added several casual details to his story. He said that the outlaws bathed in the waterfall in the canyon, that they played poker in a cave on Davis Mountain, and that from the mountain with a pair of field glasses they could see into New Mexico. Of Davis Mountain, he said, according to his uncle, "We called it Davis Mountain because a man named Davis was killed and is buried there." But Zwing Hunt failed to say where Davis Mountain was. He told, it might seem, everything worth knowing about the treasure and how to find it, except the one big thing that was the key to all the rest. His uncle, it seems, did not question him on this point. Why he didn't seems almost as puzzling an enigma as Davis Mountain itself. Except for the passing mention that from Davis Mountain one could see into New Mexico, there was nothing in the outlaw's alleged narrative that gave the slightest hint as to the location of this mystery peak. And, according to his uncle, when Zwing Hunt closed his eyes for the last long sleep, he left Davis Mountain the great Sphinx riddle of the story of buried outlaw gold. So you see, the directions left by the dying outlaw are, after all, not quite so clear as you may at first have believed. Virgil Butcher, an elder brother of Billy Grounds, whose real name was Billy Butcher, fell under the spell of the romantic tales Zwing Hunt is alleged to have told his uncle. Virgil Butcher came from Texas to Arizona for the first time to hunt the treasure in 1884, bringing with him what purported to be Zwing Hunt's original map and written directions. For more than 30 years, intermittently, he followed the trail of the treasure, making 18 expeditions into the mountains of southeastern Arizona, the Chiricahuas, Steins Pass, Peloncillo, Guadalupe, and Silver Creek ranges. Failure after failure did not discourage him, and when he died 3 years ago in Duncan, New Mexico, he still believed with the unshaken faith of a religious zealot that the tale of the Davis Mountain treasure was true. Mrs. Maggie Klinger of San Antonio is Billy Ground's sister, and she is troubled with no doubts whatever that the treasure is right where Zwing Hunt's uncle said Zwing Hunt said it was.
"I'm just as sure about that treasure as that my name is Maggie Klinger," said Mrs. Maggie Klinger. "I can see Silver Spring, the rock of the 2 crosses, and all the rest of it just as plain as if I had been in the canyon myself. I know I could walk straight to the spot where the treasure is buried if," said Mrs. Maggie Klinger, "I ever got to Davis Mountain." Bill Sanders of West Turkey Creek Canyon has been one of the most inveterate as well as most optimistic searchers for the treasure. He has lived in southeastern Arizona since early times and knows the mountains as few men know them. He went on several expeditions with Virgil Butcher. He has acted as guide for a dozen parties of treasure hunters. He has seen the original Zwing Hunt map and studied the written directions. He, too, has implicit faith in the truth of the story. "There are Davis Mountains in West Texas,"
said Bill Sanders, "but there's no Davis Peak. I heard a few months ago that the wreck of a burned wagon had been found on top of a mountain in the Davis Group. I went there and spent 3 weeks. The wreck of an old burned wagon was there, and I couldn't figure out how it ever got on top of the mountain, but there was nothing in the Davis Range that answered in any way Zwing Hunt's description of the Davis Mountain country. But after 20 years of puzzling over Davis Mountain, I believe I have at last identified it. Harris Mountain, in my opinion, is Davis Mountain. I think Zwing Hunt got the two names twisted. Harris Mountain is the eastern gatepost of Turkey Creek Canyon, a few miles from the site of Old Galeyville. It is a bald, rounded sugar loaf. The plains of the San Simon Valley run off from it on the east. The state line of New Mexico is only 20 miles away, and you can see into New Mexico with the naked eye. And there is a tunnel-like cave in Harris Mountain in which the outlaws could have played poker. The grave of a man named Davis is not there, but the grave of a man named Harris is. Also the grave of Harris's wife and 2 children, all murdered by Apaches in 1873. The Indians carried off Harris's 15-year-old daughter, and she married a buck and had a papoose. She was rescued from the Indians in 1876 by a detachment of the 2nd Cavalry, and while she was being taken to Fort Bowie, she pointed out the spot on the mountain where her family had been massacred. The soldiers found the skeletons and buried them. The peak has been known as Harris Mountain ever since. At the foot of Harris Mountain to the west is Turkey Creek Canyon, which is not in any feature like the Silver Spring Canyon described by Hunt. But a mile or a mile and a half due west of Harris Mountain is a little canyon running up into Round Valley, and I have an idea this is the canyon of the treasure story. I am going to explore this Round Valley Canyon thoroughly pretty soon on a hunt for Silver Spring and Gum Spring and the Rock of the 2 Crosses. Hearken now to the words of Rube Haddon of Paradise. "I knew all the fellows in the fight in Skeleton Canyon," said Rube. "There were only 6. They were Jim Hughes, Milt Hicks, Jack McKenzie, Ike and Billy Clanton, and another fellow whose name I've forgotten. Zwing Hunt and Billy Grounds were not within 50 miles of the fight. I heard all about the fight from Hughes, Hicks, and McKenzie a day or 2 afterward. They got only $4,000 out of the robbery. Of this, $1,400 was in Mexican dollars. The rest was in gold bullion, which they sold. Only 3 Mexicans were killed. For a few days, Hughes, Hicks, and McKenzie hid the gold bars in a log cabin at the mouth of Cave Creek Canyon below Galeyville and left Al George to watch them while they hunted up a buyer. When they had disposed of the bullion, the 3 of them went on a big drunk in Tombstone. Hughes and his bunch buried nothing in Skeleton. As for the story of the big treasure buried by Zwing Hunt and Billy Grounds at Davis Mountain, it's pure bunk. I told Virgil Butcher so when he was through here, but he was a nut over this treasure, and God Almighty couldn't have made him believe the yarn was not true. All this about the cigar box full of diamonds and the life-size gold figures of the Virgin and Christ is simply bosh. Zwing Hunt and Billy Grounds never were in Mexico in their lives. As outlaws, they didn't amount to much. I knew Zwing Hunt when he was driving a lumber wagon for Morse's sawmill. He was a better mule skinner than he was a bandit. Billy Grounds, whom I knew also, was only 19 when he was killed. If these 2 boys had had all the experience as bold freebooters in Mexico they're credited with in this fool story, they would never have acted like scared amateurs when they tried to stick up the stamp mill at Charleston. Zwing Hunt was killed by Apaches. There's no doubt about that. Billy Breckenridge and Phil Montague and several others who had known Hunt well identified the body. So you can bet everything you've got Zwing Hunt never got back to his old home in San Antonio and never told any deathbed story. The way I figure out this buried treasure romance is that Zwing Hunt's uncle faked it. It sounds like a marijuana pipe dream. There is no Davis Mountain. It is not on any map, and nobody in this country ever heard of a peak by that name. In my opinion, it never had any existence except in the crazy imagination of Zwing Hunt's uncle. But don't be disheartened by any such talk as this. Don't let a crabbed old pessimist like Rube Haddon dampen your ardor or shatter your rainbow dreams. Remember that the Cocos Island story, the world's most gorgeous legend of buried treasure, rests on facts just as nebulous as these. And though the Cocos Island treasure never has been lifted, faith in it has burned like a steady flame for 100 years. The clear-strained treasure hunter never loses faith or hope. So ho for buried treasure once again.
Saddle the ponies and slap the blanket rolls and the grub and the old camp kit on the pack mule. And don't forget the picks and shovels. Out yonder across the desert, a fortune of $3 million is waiting for you. Maybe. All you have to do, perhaps, to make it yours, is first to find Davis Mountain. End of Chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Tombstone, an Iliad of the Southwest by Walter Noble Burns. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Dale Barkley. The Honeymoon Cattle Drive. John Slaughter's pearl-handled six-shooter shines out in opalescent beauty in Tombstone's history, but it is remembered not so much for its gleaming handle as for its flaming other end. Slaughter's 4 years as sheriff of Cochise County, 1887 to 1890, was a period of reconstruction and marked the dividing line between lawlessness and law in the Tombstone country. This pearl-handled .44 was the tool with which Slaughter cemented a permanent fabric of law and order. John Horton Slaughter was of a family that had been rooted in the soil and traditions of the South since the days of the 13 colonies. He was born in Louisiana, October 2, 1841, according to an entry in the old family Bible, whose dilapidated dog-eared pages give evidence of a line of church-going forebears. With slaves and household chattels, his parents moved to West Texas while he was a baby. The Texas War of Independence, San Jacinto, and the Alamo were still fresh in the memories of Texas people, and the news of the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma at the beginning of the Mexican War of Polk's administration gave him his first remembered thrills as a boy. He grew up on the Texas steppes when buffalo were still plentiful and settlers had to fight for their lives against Kiowas and Comanches. He enlisted as a soldier under the stars and bars of the Confederacy at the outbreak of the Civil War, but after brief service was invalided home. Though little fighting against Yankees fell to his experience, he saw hard fighting against Indians and outlaws as a Texas Ranger under the noted Captain Tom. In early manhood, he embarked in the cattle business on his own, married Miss Adeline Harris, and established his ranch in Atascosa County in the Panhandle. Slaughter shared in the prosperity that came to the Texas cattle industry when the first Western railroads opened to the prairies the rich markets of the East, and the price of steers went at a bound from $1 to $20 a head. He not only raised cattle, but bought them all over West Texas, and he drove his herds to market at Dodge City and the towns and army posts west of the Pecos. In those boom times of the trails, he acted as his own herd boss and took part in all the dangers and hardships of the long drives, fighting Indians, trail cutters, and desperadoes, and becoming proficient, in a day of the strong arm, in protecting his own and holding what was his against every form of rapacity and lawless violence. While Slaughter was buying cattle in the Devil's River region of southwestern Texas, Bill Gallagher, bad man and notorious trail cutter, laid claim to several hundred of Slaughter's steers. Gallagher had the reputation of having killed 13 men in Wyoming, where he was known as the Man from Bitter Creek. For him, as for buckskin Frank Leslie, 13 had not proved an unlucky number. It was 14 that turned out to be the numeral of disaster, as in the case of the Tombstone desperado. Gallagher's reputation as a killer might have frightened some men, but not Slaughter. All bad men looked alike to this young Texas cowman. His courage was as desperate as theirs, and his skill with firearms as finished. No man from Bitter Creek, though he came from the headwaters of that classic stream, could intimidate or bulldoze him. Gallagher's brain was perhaps not so quick as his trigger finger. He would not have attempted to raid Slaughter's herd if he had known Slaughter. When Gallagher started to cut out the brands he claimed as his own, Slaughter stopped him. "Do you see that trail out yonder leading north?" said Slaughter. "That's your trail. Hit it." Slaughter was a small man, and the giant from Bitter Creek bridled at this audacity.
"Do you know who I am?"
he blurted ferociously. "Hit that trail," said Slaughter, "and hit it quick." For a moment Gallagher stared into Slaughter's hard black eyes. The bad man saw something in those eyes that convinced him that trail over yonder leading north was, after all, his trail. Without a word, he hit it. Driving his herd up the Pecos bound for market at Las Vegas, Slaughter went into camp near Fort Sumner at the old Bosque Grande ranch of John Chisholm, cattle king of New Mexico. Bent on revenge, Gallagher, who lived in these parts, rode along to Slaughter's camp. He was armed with a shotgun loaded with buckshot and 2 6-shooters. This armament, formidable under ordinary circumstances, again proved Gallagher's lack of perspicacity. He was plainly a blundering rank-and-file desperado who knew only how to pull a trigger. Slaughter, on the other hand, was a master strategist. He had not fought Comanches and outlaws all these years in the Panhandle for nothing. Gallagher's prospective 14th victim was different from all the other 13. Gallagher saw Slaughter standing alone on an open hillside that sloped from the Pecos and rode toward him at a gallop. His idea was to get to close quarters as quickly as possible, where his double-barreled shotgun would give him every advantage. None of his murders had ever looked easier. But to Gallagher's amazement, Slaughter did not wait quietly to be massacred. With his long-range rifle, Slaughter shot Gallagher's pony from under him while the bad man was still out of shotgun range. Horse and rider went down in a smother of dust. This was disconcerting, but having disentangled himself from his pony, Gallagher went charging forward on foot, opening fire with a 6-shooter. Still, he was badly handicapped. At the distance, his 6-shooter was no match for Slaughter's rifle. One of Slaughter's bullets broke Gallagher's right arm. Gallagher drew his second 6-shooter and still went forward firing. He staggered under the impact of a second bullet that struck him in the breast. 2 more tore through his body and brought him down. Slaughter's cowboys carried the wounded man to the Bosque Grande ranch house. Slaughter stood at the side of the bed as Gallagher was dying. "You done right, Slaughter," said Gallagher. "If you hadn't got me, I'd have got you. I don't mind much being killed. It would have served me right if I had been downed 20 years ago. But it kind of pains me to be outgeneraled that-a-way. If I'd had any sense, I'd fetched along a rifle. I didn't have no business with that shotgun. I'd oughter knowed better." That was the whole trouble with Gallagher, lack of generalship. He seems to have had courage. If he had mingled a little brains with it, the man from Bitter Creek might be living yet. He oughter knowed better. When he had sold his herd at Las Vegas, Slaughter discovered that he had lost many cattle on the drive up the Pecos. On his way back to Texas, he combed the herds of ranchmen in a hunt for his brand. This was his right under the law, but there was mighty little law on the Pecos in those days, and the effrontery of this stranger in demanding the return of his own property was deeply resented by the cattlemen of that wild country. But Slaughter's courage was clean strain, and painstakingly and patiently he saw the dangerous job through to the end. From John Chisholm's range, Slaughter gathered in 60 of his lost steers. Chisholm produced a bill of sale to show he had purchased them. Slaughter smiled grimly in the old cattle king's face. "And you got 'em at a fine bargain," Slaughter said, as he ordered his cowboys to drive the cattle away. From the herd of a man named Underwood, Slaughter reclaimed more than 100 of his cows. Underwood swore he would have the cattle back or kill Slaughter. With 2 friends, Underwood rode to Slaughter's camp. When he saw the 3 heavily armed men approaching, Slaughter dismounted on the opposite side of his horse and leveled his rifle across the saddle. "I bought and paid for them cattle," shouted Underwood as Slaughter covered him. "Try to take them," answered Slaughter. But Underwood thought it diplomatic to decline the invitation, and with his 2 companions rode home. Farther down the Pecos, 2 rustlers and 2 half-breeds announced their intention of murdering Slaughter. A Mexican vaquero with Slaughter became panic-stricken as he saw the 4 bravos galloping toward camp. "Fight or get," ordered Slaughter. The Mexican got. Before he went, Slaughter in a jiffy paid him what money was coming to him and reached for his own rifle at the same moment. By the time Slaughter had drawn the gun from the sheath, the Mexican had faded to a speck in the distance and was still going. Slaughter dropped a few long-distance bullets among the 4 enemies who were lifting the long yell as they came racing for him. The little leaden greeting surprised them. They halted. Then, as the bullets continued to shower about them, they turned tail and ran. Guns and threats having failed to stop Slaughter in the work of collecting his lost cattle, John Richardson, whose herd also had come under levy, swore out a warrant. The deputy sheriff reported to Richardson that he had been unable to serve the paper. "Why not?" flared Richardson. "Well," replied the deputy, "Slaughter wouldn't let me. He drew a gun and told me to light out. Under the circumstances, I thought it best to keep the warrant in my pocket." But after the deputy had gone, Slaughter rode for Richardson's ranch. He proposed to discuss this matter personally. Richardson met him on the road. "I've made up my mind to withdraw that complaint," said Richardson. "Sorry to have caused you any trouble." So at last, having recovered most of the cattle he had lost, Slaughter drove them home to his ranch in the Panhandle. When Slaughter first visited Arizona in 1877, there were not as many cattle in the territory as he himself came to own in later years. The small population was centered in the towns. The railroads had not yet arrived. The land still lay under the menace of Apache raids and ambuscades. But riches were waiting in this country for the cattleman with the courage to brave its dangers and the fortune to survive them. The great valleys that swept north out of Mexico and succeeded one another from east to west like the troughs of mighty waves whose crests were mountain ranges, were ideal cattle country without cattle. Winters in this border region were like spring. Occasional light snows quickly melted or evaporated. It was cool in the mountains in summer and pleasant in the valleys in winter, and in mountains and valleys were abundant grass and browse the year round. The San Simon, Sulphur Springs, and San Pedro valleys seemed calling aloud for cattle to come and grow fat in the belly-deep grama of their wild pastures. For 2 years Slaughter wavered. Then the silver strike in the Tombstone Hills, with its consequent influx of thousands of people and the sudden rise of a city in the desert, brought his determination to a focus. He pulled up stakes in the Panhandle and began the long trek to the San Pedro. When the grass was turning green in the spring of 1879, Slaughter lined his cattle out on the trail. Guarded by cowboys, the herd wound across the Llano Estacado, down the western escarpments of those treeless plains, across the Pecos and the Penasco in the neighborhood of Seven Rivers, and on through the Sacramento Mountains. At Tularosa, Slaughter ordered a halt. There was need for rest. The journey had been hard, and it would grow harder farther on. Just beyond lay the white sands, the volcanic desert of the Malpais, and the desolate strip known to the early Spaniards as the Jornada del Muerto. But something else besides rest prompted Slaughter to halt just there. At Tularosa there was a girl. "Oh-ho, Mr. Slaughter, a little romance, eh?" Now the cowboys understood why he had taken this particular route, why he had relaxed a little his old-time iron discipline, how it happened they had caught him every once in a while smiling to himself. If they had had the brains of a yearling steer, they'd have suspected something like this. Well, the boss had been a widower for 2 years, and his heart was lonely. Now Viola Howell had quietly dropped her rope over his horns. That's the way such things happened. And Viola Howell was a beauty, if you please, as fresh and wholesome and sweet as an anemone on the spring mountains. So in Tularosa, Viola Howell and John Slaughter were married. The trample of hoofs and the clash of horns were their epithalamium, and the cattle, pushing on through deserts and mountain valleys under dust clouds that went up to the skies, blazed a honeymoon trail into Arizona. Mr. and Mrs. Amazon Howell, the bride's parents, threw in their herd with Slaughters, and accompanied by Stonewall and James Howell, their sons, followed the fortunes of their new son-in-law. They came at length to the Rio Grande. A week before, the river had been a placid stream, whispering about innumerable dry sandbanks, and so shallow a man could wade it. Now the spring freshet, caused by melting snows in the mountains, had turned it into a wild torrent, swirling and roaring between low mud banks. Driftwood tossed on its foaming yellow surface. Occasional trees, undermined and uprooted, shot down the current like battering rams torn loose from their moorings. Slaughter was confronted with a problem such as sometimes faced the pioneers of an earlier day on the Oregon and overland trails. Fortunately, he knew the frontier technique of crossing swollen rivers. On cattle drives to the Kansas railroads, he frequently had to swim his herd and float his wagons across the Red and Cimarron when those streams were on a rampage. He had 3 wagons loaded with household goods to ferry across the Rio Grande, one drawn by 6 horses, the other 2 by 4. To both sides of his wagons he attached long logs projecting beyond the ends to float the wagons and steady them. Having repacked his cargoes and lashed everything tight, he was ready for the plunge. Slaughter and his bride, Mrs. Howell, and her son James, took their places in the 6-horse wagon. John Baptiste, a Negro known as Old Bat, for years a servant in the Slaughter family and famous for his teamster skill, was in the driver's seat. Mr. Howell, the bride's father, an expert swimmer, grasped the bridle reins of the near leader and led the team into the water. For a short distance, the horses staggered and slipped as the stream boiled around them. Then they were swept off their feet, sank until only their heads and shoulders showed above the surface, and struck out on the long swim. The wagon washed downstream. Old Bat pointed his horses at an upstream angle. They had reached midstream when the right-hand horse of the two in the middle, known as the swingers, caught its foreleg in the crosstree of the leader ahead. The contretemps threw the animal off its swimming stride. It went under and came up snorting and plunging. Its mad antics confused and terrorized its teammates. Disaster threatened. But Old Bat, with 4 lives in his keeping, rose to the occasion. That off-swinger had to swim. That's all there was to it. About the unfortunate beast, the old Negro made his black snake snap and snarl. His deep bass voice roared threats and objurgations. "I'll larn you to swim, drat your bay hide. Buckle down that. Get on cross dis river." Mr. Howell, swimming at the downstream side of the near leader, one hand on the bridle, shouted encouragement to the team to stave off panic. "Whoa, boys! Steady, boys!" Mrs. Slaughter suddenly became hysterical. She began to scream wildly at the top of her voice. Her mother attempted to quiet her. No use. Her husband put his arms around her and tried to calm her. Equally vain. She had to scream, and she screamed in spite of hell and high water. With Old Bat roaring, Old Man Howell emitting soothing yells, the bride shrieking, and the off-swinger madly plunging. It was a wild time out there in the middle of the raging Rio Grande. But the leaders struck bottom at last. The other animals found their footing. Out of the eddying flood and up the steep bank they went in mighty lunges. After the 2 other wagons had got safely over, the yelling cowboys sent the cattle into the river with a rush. In a moment the broad stream was crowded with heads, streaking like horned meteors across a yellow sky, bumping into tangled masses, filling the air with mad bawlings and the hollow clashing of horns. Some went under. Calves swimming beside their mothers were crushed and drowned. Downstream dead bodies floated, but one by one the brutes struck the solid ground of the far shore. They shook the water like rain from their glistening hides and fell to grazing. The herd was lined out upon the trail once more, and the wagons got under way. The big adventure over, everybody laughed, even the bride. From the other side the Rio Grande had seemed a stream of turgid ugliness. From this side it had a certain majestic beauty. When it comes to rivers, the bank you stand on sometimes makes all the difference in the world. "See that range ahead?" Slaughter said to his bride one morning, after the drive had left Silver City and Shakespeare behind, and had come into the northern reaches of the Animas. "Arizona on the other side of those mountains." Mrs. Slaughter thrilled joyously. It was as if he had echoed the words of old school-day essays, "Beyond the Alps lies Italy." Through the Steins Pass Mountains the cattle poured out into the San Simon Valley, and rounding the northern end of the Chiricahuas, passed into Sulphur Springs Valley. Here on the eastern slopes of the Dragoons, beyond which the new town of Tombstone was booming into life, Slaughter pitched camp for the summer. The drive begun in Texas in the latter part of March, ended in Arizona, May 10th. In this Sulphur Springs Valley camp, Slaughter, standing at the gateway of the Promised Land, was saved from death by Billy Claiborne, one of his cowboys, the same Billy Claiborne afterward killed by buckskin Frank Leslie. Attacked by an infuriated steer and borne to the ground, Slaughter in another moment would have been fatally gored if Claiborne had not galloped up and flung himself from the saddle upon the animal's horns. In as fine an exhibition of bulldogging as ever drew thunders of applause from crowded stands at rodeos in Cheyenne, Pendleton, and Chicago, Claiborne fought and wrestled the mad brute to the earth, pinioned it down, conquered it, and enabled his employer to scramble from his perilous predicament. Those of today who look upon bulldogging as mere cowboy sport of no possible practical value doubtless would place a more serious estimate upon it if they had witnessed Claiborne's life-saving feat. "I figured," said Claiborne gallantly, as he laughed over the incident, "that if I had been killed, I'd not have been leaving a young widow behind." Slaughter, having scouted the country for a ranch location, settled in August a little south of the old Hereford stage station in the San Pedro Valley. Here he built a 2-room shack of poles with dirt roof, dirt floor, and a slab door without a lock, and here in this crude home at the end of Honeymoon Trail, he and his bride set up housekeeping. Prosperity came quickly. Markets were close at hand. Meeting the demand for cattle became the big problem. A second herd Slaughter had left behind in the Panhandle was brought out by John Roberts as foreman. Slaughter himself returned to Texas the following winter and drove out a third herd. He was awarded contracts for supplying beef to the San Carlos Reservation and to the construction camps of the new railroad being built from Benson to Nogales. His growing business necessitated extensive cattle buying in Mexico, which swarmed with cattle when Arizona had almost none. Carrying cash money to pay for his purchases, he made many trips across the line. Outlaws and Apaches lurked beside his trails. Many times they sought to trap him. Against white and red marauders he was at constant war, and braving death became a part of his daily routine. There was no fear in Slaughter, but his wife, in her lonely cabin, lived in the shadow of fear. Any day a messenger might come with information that her husband had been ambushed and murdered.
"When Mr. Slaughter started for Texas to bring out the third herd," said Mrs. Slaughter, in recalling their pioneer experiences, "his young daughter Addie and I accompanied him. He sent his cowboys ahead with orders to meet him in Deming. He and I and the little girl took the train at Benson over the Southern Pacific Railroad that had just been built. Deming, the future metropolis of western New Mexico, consisted then of several tents and 2 boxcars. One of the boxcars was a grocery store, and the other the residence of a locomotive engineer and his wife. Our cowboys had failed to meet us. We had no place to sleep. It was the dead of winter and terribly cold. Mr. Slaughter asked the engineer's wife to allow Addie and me to pass the night in the boxcar, but her husband was away on his run, and the poor woman, alone in that wild country, was afraid to take us in. Late that night, while we huddled about a campfire, the train came in, and the hospitable engineer, apologizing for his wife's conduct, took us to his strange little dwelling. As I sat warm and snug by the stove, I realized what a wonderful home a boxcar can be. Next night, our cowboys had still not arrived. Again, Mr. Slaughter asked the engineer's wife to take us in, and again, being alone, she refused. Once more, when the train rolled in, the engineer came for us, but Mr. Slaughter this time declined the invitation. He had had enough of that woman's foolishness, and we shivered by our campfire till morning. Then we learned our cowboys, having misunderstood orders, were in camp 20 miles east. Mr. Slaughter paid a man with a team of horses $20 to drive us there, $1 a mile. When we found our cowboys, we felt a little bitter over the unnecessary hardships we had endured, when, with better luck, we might have been enjoying the good cheer of a comfortable camp. On the trip back from Texas with the herd, we had a number of Indian scares. Victorio and his Apaches had been plundering and murdering through all that part of New Mexico for months, and every little while we would hear of the massacre of some ranchman and his family. The herd had been bucking snowdrifts for 3 days almost without a bite of food, when in a blinding blizzard of wind and snow we went into camp 10 miles from Fort Bayard. There was a foot of snow on the ground, and still the snow came down in sheets that slanted sharply on the whistling icy gale, and we could find no wood for a fire. A teamster passed with 3 logs on his wagon. Mr. Slaughter offered him $10 for a log, but refusing money, the man gave us one. Soon we had a fire roaring. Darkness was falling when a stagecoach bound for Fort Bayard came along. The driver begged Addie and me to go with him to the fort. The officers would welcome us and make us comfortable, he said, and the next morning he would bring us back to camp on his return trip. But I could not think of leaving my husband. At the outset of the trip, I had made up my mind to share all dangers and hardships with him, and on this night of storm I felt my place was by his side. There was no sleep for anyone. Addie and I froze by our fire. Mr. Slaughter and his men, numb with cold and white from head to foot with frozen snow, rode herd all night and had all they could do to prevent a stampede. We heard 50 miles farther along the trail that the very next day after we had met the kind-hearted stage driver, he was murdered by Apaches at the spot where we had camped. Slaughter kissed his wife goodbye at the door of his San Pedro Valley ranch and rode off for Mexico to buy cattle. With him were John Roberts and Old Bat, and $12,000 in Mexican silver jingled in the aparejo of his pack mule. Having gathered together a small herd, he made camp near Magdalena in Sonora. A troop of 45 heavily armed Mexicans coming up from the south rode into the village. "¿Quiénes son estos?" Slaughter asked of one of half a dozen vaqueros he had hired.
"Estos," replied the vaquero in a frightened whisper, "son bandidos." All the country south of the line was then infested with these roving robber bands that pillaged and murdered with a free hand. As they drank in the cantina, the bandits had word of the gringo cattle buyer and his sack of money. By all the saints, they swore over their mescal before next sunrise that treasure should be theirs. One by one, Slaughter's Mexican vaqueros came to him, and with apologies and profound regrets, gave notice that they could no longer continue in his service. "Be on your guard tonight, señor," said one. "But as for me, my mother has just died, and I must hasten home." "It will be well, caballero," said another, "if you and your men sleep with your eyes open, but my brother lies at the point of death, and I must hurry to his bedside." So they departed, and Slaughter, Roberts, and Old Bat were left to fight it out alone, 3 against 45. Knowing it would be death to sleep in camp, Slaughter went from house to house in the little town seeking shelter for the night, the shelter of bulletproof adobe walls. But the town people shook their heads. They could not afford to be hospitable. Fear of the bandits closed their doors. While the bandits still sat at their toddies, Slaughter and his 2 companions stole out of the village with their treasure-laden mule. In the mountains 5 miles away, they went into hiding in a carefully selected position on a ledge high against the wall of a narrow canyon. Mrs. Slaughter, in her cabin on the San Pedro, heard a pounding of horses' hoofs. A courier brought news that Slaughter had been murdered. The message she had so long dreaded had come at last. She hitched up her buckboard and set off alone for the Mexican line, her horses at a run. At the LES ranch, where the customs officials made their headquarters, no one had any information. Slaughter and his men had crossed the border a week before, and nothing more had been heard of them. Mrs. Slaughter drove hard for Magdalena. Far ahead, she saw a filmy speck on the horizon. It grew into what seemed smoke. It took on the appearance of a cloud. Then unmistakably it changed into a curtain of dust shaking against the sky. She whipped up her horses. The sun began to flash on the horns of cattle. She made out the herd winding toward her. A little later, she threw herself into her husband's arms. Roberts and Old Bat drew around her, laughing. When the Mexican bandits had drunk their fill of mescal, they mounted their horses and rode out of Magdalena to Slaughter's camp. It seemed a simple matter to massacre these 3 gringos and steal their money. But the camp was deserted. Off to the mountains the bandits galloped on the trail. They dashed into the canyon. As they rode at dusk through a narrow passage where the precipitous cliffs almost came together, 3 rifles blazed from the shadows darkening the gorge. As the bullets whizzed among them, the Mexicans halted for one amazed moment and then fled for their lives. "And that," Slaughter used to say, "is the only time I remember ever having been murdered." All this while, Slaughter was achieving a reputation as an Indian fighter. Adept in all the wiles and stratagems of the cunning warcraft of the Apaches, he outfought them on their own ground and in their own way. The lore of the war trails he had learned from the savages themselves enabled him to avoid their hidden snares and ambuscades, and surprise the trappers in the traps they had set for him. No band of Apaches invaded the San Pedro that Slaughter did not take its trail. He fought to protect his own, and in time he made the land safe wherever his cattle grazed. The Apaches came to fear this sleepless man who fought so desperately, and at last old Geronimo himself gave his warriors orders to leave Slaughter and his herds alone. His success as an Indian fighter made Slaughter in demand as a scout with the army, and he saw service under Generals Crook and Miles against Geronimo, Nana, Natchez, Ju, Chato, Bonito, and Chihuahua. He took part in the last campaign against Geronimo, and was with General Miles when in 1886 the famous old chief surrendered at Skeleton Canyon. John Slaughter had 2 singular but firmly rooted convictions. One was that he could not be killed. The other was that he lived under the care of a guardian angel that warned him against invisible and unsuspected danger and protected him in every desperate emergency. When Mr. and Mrs. Slaughter left Charleston one day to drive to Santa Cruz, Ed Lyle, Cap Stillwell, and 4 other men, all outlaws and Slaughter's enemies, cut across country to intercept them. Passing through a wild region, Slaughter saw the 6 men spurring hard for a clump of willows far ahead beside the trail. He believed the outlaws meant to assassinate him from ambush. He gave the reins to his wife and sat with a shotgun across his lap. "We'll both be killed at those willows," cried Mrs. Slaughter in a panic. "Don't be afraid," returned Slaughter. "Neither of us will be killed. Those outlaws won't kill a woman, and they can't kill me. If they fire on us, I'll jump out and do my fighting on foot. You wait for me out of range. I'll rejoin you. Mrs. Slaughter lashed her horses. It was a race between her and the outlaws. She won. The 6 horsemen were still several hundred yards distant when her buggy swept past the clump of trees. The outlaws did not attempt pursuit.
"What did you mean by saying they couldn't kill you?"
asked Mrs. Slaughter.
"Just that," answered her husband. "No man can kill me. I wasn't born to be killed. How I know that I cannot explain. But I know it. When my time comes, I'll die in bed."
Slaughter met Lyle a few days later in Herrera's store in Charleston and drew his 6-shooter.
"Lyle," he said, "that little affair the other day is the last trick you'll ever play on me."
"I'm unarmed, Slaughter," pleaded Lyle. "Don't kill me."
"I ought to kill you, but I'll give you your life," replied Slaughter. "But you get out of the country. I'll give you 24 hours. If I ever see you around here again, I'll kill you."
A horseman galloped out of Charleston on the Benson Road early next morning. At Benson he kept on going. This was the well-known desperado, Ed Lyle, obeying orders. And the San Pedro country knew him no more. Slaughter met Cap Stillwell in a week or so in a Charleston saloon. Both went for their guns, and Slaughter got the drop. As he looked into the muzzle of Slaughter's 6-shooter, Stillwell got his 24-hour orders. Next day he followed Lyle. Mounted on his gray horse that for several years was as familiar to Tombstone as Slaughter himself, Slaughter was riding toward Tubac, the ancient pueblo founded by the pioneer Spaniards south of Tucson. He was bound for Marsh and Driscoll's ranch to buy a bunch of cattle and had the money to pay for them in his pockets. He was in no hurry. He jogged along at a leisurely gait. The peaceful landscape was bathed in sunshine. No one was in sight in all the circle of the horizon. Suddenly, something seemed to whisper into Slaughter's ear. "You are in danger. Ride fast and ride hard." He made no attempt to reason away the warning or to argue with his invisible guardian, but putting spurs to his horse, rode at top speed into Tubac. There he talked a few moments with a storekeeper and rode toward his destination. But now he rode slowly. He no longer felt the urge for speed. Whatever the danger was, he knew it was past. An hour later, 3 curly-bill outlaws galloped into Tubac, their horses lathered with sweat. They inquired of the storekeeper if Slaughter had passed that way. When they learned that Slaughter was an hour ahead of them, they cursed their luck and took the back trail. These 3 outlaws, as it was afterward established, had trailed Slaughter from the San Pedro Valley. The mysterious warning had saved Slaughter's money and probably his life. Slaughter's ranch near Hereford was only a few miles south of that of the Clantons, and Slaughter's herds suffered from the depredations of these bold rustlers. Several times Slaughter rode to the Clanton ranch with a band of cowboys at his back and forcibly took back his stolen stock. Once he met Ike Clanton on his land and, drawing his gun, ordered him off, telling him he would kill him if he ever again caught him on his range. This rankled with Ike Clanton. He boasted in Charleston saloons he would even matters with this cattleman who was attempting to lord it in the Clantons' own domain. Mr. and Mrs. Slaughter, in their buckboard, were driving from Tombstone to their ranch one night. It was a quiet night, and the valley was lighted by a full moon. Abruptly, Slaughter made a remark for which there seemed no reason. "You drive the team," he said to his wife. "I want my gun in my hand."
"Why, what's the matter?" asked his wife in astonishment. "I see nothing to cause alarm."
"Neither do I," replied Slaughter, "but do as I say." Mrs. Slaughter took the lines, and her husband drew his 6-shooter and held it in his lap. They drove on for several miles. Nothing happened. The drawn revolver seemed so out of keeping with the peaceful night that Mrs. Slaughter began to laugh. Far ahead they suddenly heard the beat of a horse's hoofs. A horseman rode out of the misty distance. The moonlight glittered on a 6-shooter in his hand. It was Ike Clanton. As the moonlight glittered on Slaughter's 6-shooter also, the outlaw went by in silence. Slaughter had had no means of knowing he would encounter an enemy on the road. It was another one of his uncanny warnings. On another occasion the clairvoyance of Slaughter's gray horse seemed superior to that of its master. Riding alone at night on the trail of a criminal, and fatigued by a hard day's journey, Slaughter picketed his horse and threw himself on the ground to sleep. The tired horse would neither rest nor graze. It nudged Slaughter with its nozzle. Sleepy and annoyed, Slaughter pushed it away, but the animal persisted. Still Slaughter refused to pay heed. Finally the horse pawed Slaughter gently on the head with its forefoot. This was enough. The warning was clear. Slaughter saddled and rode. After going 10 miles or so, he again threw himself down for sleep. This time the horse grazed quietly. Slaughter always believed some unseen danger threatened him that night, but he never learned what it was. So in the fullness of time, John Slaughter rose to riches and power on the frontier and became a cattle king, fighting fearlessly and ceaselessly for his life, his home, his property, and the right to live in peace. He developed those qualities of mind and body that fitted him, when the hour came, to rule in Tombstone as sheriff and establish order in a land that had been the most lawless in the Southwest. End of Chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Tombstone, an Iliad of the Southwest by Walter Noble Burns. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Dale Barkley. The Round Tables Last Night. Deep in the shaft of the sulphuret mine, a miner swung his pick. A loosened fragment of rock rolled against his boots. From the cavity oozed a few drops of water. They trickled down a stone slab in little dashes and zigzags and curlicues that were in very truth hieroglyphics of disaster. The cryptic message written by the water on the mine's dark wall spelled the doom of Tombstone. The mines were at the high tide of prosperity. Immense quantities of silver were being taken out. The rich lodes seemed inexhaustible. Then, without warning, water was struck at a depth of 500 feet. An initial trickle became a flood. A subterranean lake or river apparently had been tapped. It seemed to underlie the entire range of hills. All the mines were affected. Bailing was impossible. The water boiled into the shafts in geyser spouts as thick as a man's body. The Grand Central and Contention mines, at an expense of $300,000, installed steam pumps. But the pumps drew water from all the mines. Their task, it was apparent from the beginning, was almost hopeless. When the surface pumping works were destroyed by fire in 1886, the water rose in the shafts all over the hill to a great depth within an hour, and all the Tombstone mines closed down. The water was like an impenetrable armor plate guarding vast silver treasure still unmined. Wealth with an estimated value of hundreds of millions of dollars remain in the Tombstone Hills today. Probably it will remain untouched forever. With the silver foundations on which it had been built suddenly washed away, Tombstone suffered a disaster comparable to that from an earthquake or a volcano in overwhelming eruption. Its boom collapsed. An army of miners departed. The exodus of citizens was like a flight. All the trails were crowded with wagons, piled high with household goods, rolling off over the horizon. From 15,000 to 3,000, the number of inhabitants dwindled so quickly the change seemed like black magic. Stores, saloons, and gambling places closed their doors. Allen Street, once noisy with traffic, showed only a dull spark of animation. Plate glass windows of vacant business establishments stared blankly, like the eyeless sockets of death's heads, out into the empty thoroughfare. Grass grew in outlying streets, lined block on block with tenantless dwellings. Spiders spun their webs in the cribs and dens and haunts of revelry of the old red-light district. All the old picturesque life vanished. Yesterday it was here, today it was gone. With the coming of night, the silence of the Mesquite Mesa leaped upon the town, as if from ambush, and clutched it in deathly stillness. The shell of a metropolis housed the population of a village. The busiest, gayest, wildest, toughest little city in the Southwest faded into a ghost town. Tombstone, dying in the desert, was left to its tragedy. This decadent period was notable for a lax administration of law and the absence of strong men at the helm of public affairs. Crime flourished as never before. Though the heroic era of Curly Bill was gone, and cattle raids across the border were out of style, and outlawry had lost its romance, the criminals were pestiferously active. It was an age of thieves rather than bandits. The country was overrun with a vermin of horse thieves and cattle thieves. Though they operated on a small scale, they kept eternally at it. No horse was safe in its stall, no milk cow in a stable lot or pasture. Burglars, practically unknown on the old frontier, made their appearance. Men were held up on dark streets. It became dangerous for a citizen to venture out of town because of lurking highwaymen. Criminals were showing a disposition to organize. Their depredations became bolder and more extensive. Tombstone was their headquarters, and the town was gradually passing under their secret domination. Casting about for a man with the force and courage to handle a serious situation that every day was growing more sinister and menacing, Tombstone turned its eyes upon John Slaughter. He had no ambition for office. His cattle business kept him fully occupied. But his election as sheriff was a public call to the man for the hour and the job. Like a modern Cincinnatus, he turned his back upon his ranch and his personal interests to perform a public duty. For the next 4 years, the history of Sheriff Slaughter was virtually the history of Tombstone. A memorable, wholly unique character was this John Slaughter, of iron will, iron courage, iron determination, a man of iron. A remarkable combination of thinker and fighter, intellect and trigger finger. A grim, impressively silent man, isolated, wrapped about with loneliness, keeping his own counsels and his own secrets, taking advice from no one. No genius for words, almost inarticulate, but a man of quick judgments and decisive action. A cold exterior belied a fiery, restless, relentless personality. His spirit was like a flame burning in a casing of ice. An upright, honorable man, direct, businesslike. To his friends, friendly. To his enemies and the enemies of law, embodied in himself, coldly, tragically, remorselessly merciless. He was a small, powerful man, broad shoulders, thick neck, only 5 feet 6 inches in height, black hair, black mustache, black beard, coal black eyes. A naturally fair skin had been burned by years of wind and sun to the tinge of tanned leather. He radiated alertness and energy. The snap and vim of him suggested an electric aura. "No one on whom Slaughter bestowed the most casual glance ever forgot his eyes," said A.H. Gardner of Tombstone. "They were the blackest, brightest, most penetrating eyes I ever saw. I should think it would have been difficult to lie to Slaughter. When he looked at me, his eyes seemed to be burning a hole into my brain. I used to fancy he was taking an inventory of all my secrets. If someone had held a newspaper at the back of my head, it wouldn't have surprised me if Slaughter, looking straight through my skull, had read the want ads." Slaughter not only saw everything in front of him with marvelously keen vision, but everything at both sides as well. He rarely turned his head. He turned his eyes instead, taking in all about him with constant sidelong glances. He talked with lips that hardly moved. His voice was low and of throaty quality, but he spoke distinctly. He rarely raised his voice, but everyone within sound of it listened. Those to whom he gave an order jumped to obey it. He did not stammer, but he had a way of beginning a remark with, I say. One of his quaint maxims was, I say, always shoot first and holler, throw up your hands afterwards. Though not a dandy, he was fussy about his clothes, which were always of expensive material, tailored and immaculate. His broad-brimmed white hat was creased along the center in his sheriff's days, but in later years was tucked in around the top to give the appearance of a low crown. He took a Western man's pride in his boots. He never wore shoes, and had them made to measure by a special bootmaker. They were half boots, after the cowboy fashion, high-heeled, with a touch of color and fancy stitching at the tops, and of the finest, softest leather. His trousers were always tucked in them, and his heavy roweled spurs were never removed. Anyone who failed to see Slaughter's face could identify him by his feet. A black Mexican cigar clenched between his even white teeth seemed a part of him, and associated with him as indelibly in Tombstone's memory as his gray horse were a diamond ring on the little finger of his left hand and a pearl-handled six-shooter worn at his belt where his right hand could drop on it instantly. Slaughter was rather free and easy with his intimates, but maintained an aloof dignity among strangers and resented familiarity. A man who had met him in Texas greeted him boisterously in a Kansas hotel with, "Hello, Tex." "Good morning, sir," responded Slaughter with cold courtesy. Next day, the irrepressible person again shouted, "Hello, Tex." Slaughter fixed his glittering black eyes on the man. "My name is Slaughter," he said. "If you ever think it necessary to speak to me again, just remember, my name is Slaughter." With those sharp black eyes of his, Slaughter was able to see distant objects sometimes invisible to those of ordinary vision. Riding one day with his niece and another young woman, he pointed to a crack on a mountain wall. "Do either of you girls see anything up there?" he asked. Both scrutinized the cliff long and carefully. No, they saw nothing.
"But wait a moment, Uncle John," cried his niece. "Don't show us. We'll find it yet."
Again they scanned the bluff with meticulous glances.
"There's absolutely nothing there,"
they declared. "Let's see," answered Slaughter. He drew his six-shooter, and apparently without taking aim, fired. Something fell from the crack in the mountain wall. The astonished young ladies hurried to see what it might be. It was a buff-colored owl of the exact shade of the rock against which it had been perched. No one ever saw Slaughter that his pearl-handled six-shooter was not hanging at his side. He wore it in his home. He used to be suspected that he slept with it on. He doubtless would have felt undressed without it. Moreover, he could do some remarkably fine shooting with it. He was rated, in unprecise phrase, as a dead shot. Certainly he was a crack shot. Whenever he shot, something usually dropped. His gleaming gun handle might have borne a number of notches if he had cared to file them there. How many is still a matter of conjecture. Modern Tombstone's answer to inquiries on this subject is vague. "Slaughter killed plenty," is the usual reply. Estimates run from 6 to 8 or 20, and all estimates are guesses. Slaughter never told how many men he had killed, and he alone knew. He cared nothing for fame as a man with a gun-handle record. The record itself was enough. He remained silent on his record to the end of his life. But hidden in his silence were many tragedies. For his job as sheriff, all the experience of Slaughter's life had equipped him. All his past had been preparation. He was not an office sheriff. He did not sit at a mahogany desk and give orders to deputies. He was a hard-riding sheriff, forever in the saddle. Whatever hard or dangerous work there was to do, he did it himself, or took an active part in it. Nor was it his wont to ride with a posse at his back. In pursuit of a criminal, he usually rode alone. He was a frontiersman who knew his frontier. He could follow a trail invisible to eyes less keen, with the uncanny ability of an Apache. Deserts and mountains were like a printed page to him. A broken stalk of grass, a bent weed, an upturned pebble guided him. He did not dash off at random to some town to which it might be logical to assume a fugitive would flee. It was his custom to track a man step by step and sign by sign, and usually, at the end of the trails he followed, a man threw up his hands or died. Slaughter was not troubled with hairline distinctions, and in dealing with criminals he sometimes lost sight of the fact that he was only an officer of the law, and became the law himself. He had little confidence in courts and juries, but implicit faith in the justice of John Slaughter. Instead of arresting a man, he sometimes ordered him out of the country. There was, of course, no law in the statute books to sanction such a czar-like ukase, but for the nonce these orders became the law, and very effective law at that. Invariably, the man upon whom fell the edict of banishment folded his tents and disappeared. What is more, he never came back. He knew Slaughter would kill him if he did not go, and would kill him if he ventured to return. To him, the fierce little tiger man guarding the peace of Tombstone loomed like a heroic statue of certain death. Horse stealing was not punishable by death under Arizona law, but under Slaughter's personal code it was a capital offense. If a horse was stolen from a Tombstone stable, as not infrequently was the case, the citizens would always count upon seeing shortly Slaughter's strapping gray standing saddled at the hitching rack in front of the courthouse. Then down the steps the sheriff would come marching, mount, and ride out of town. He would say goodbye to no one. No one, not even his chief deputy, would know where he was going. For a week, perhaps, nothing would be heard of him. Then, some fine day, he would come riding back, the stolen horse jogging behind on a lead rope. No questions would be asked. Slaughter would vouchsafe no information. What had become of the horse thief remained Slaughter's secret. "I was inspector of customs located at Tombstone for 2 years while Slaughter was sheriff," said Jeff Milton of Fairbank, a fighter himself. "He and I were good friends. He rode by my house one day going out after a horse thief. 'I'll saddle up and go along and help you, John,' I said. 'Never mind,' Slaughter answered. 'It's only one Mexican. I'll get him.' I guess he got him. Slaughter rode back with a stolen horse. Every time he went out after a stolen horse, he always brought it back. But I don't remember ever seeing him bring back the horse thief. Slaughter would never allow any man to get behind him, not even a friend. I used to try it just for fun. While I talked with him, I'd edge around a little to one side. Slaughter would turn and keep his face to me. I'd edge a little farther. Slaughter would turn again. If I kept up the joke, Slaughter would turn completely round before our conversation ended. When I was in Benson one day, I stepped up to a lunch wagon to buy a sandwich. 4 nigger soldiers were standing at the counter, and one of them shoved me aside. I stuck a 6-shooter in his belly and made him and his 3 buddies line up and keep their hands in the air until I'd finished my sandwich. As I walked off, I met Slaughter. I say, said John. I don't know why those niggers didn't shoot you. I've been standing here with a cocked 6-shooter trained on 'em all the time you were eating. And, added Milton, if those niggers had made a move, Slaughter would have turned that 6-shooter loose. I don't believe Slaughter thought any more of killing a man, if it seemed to him the man deserved death, than he did of putting a bullet through a tin can." Full of stories of the early days, is Jim Wolfe, past 70 now, who for more than 30 years has been living absolutely alone on a little cattle ranch in the San Pedro Valley, a few miles south of Charleston. "Many a time," said Jim Wolfe, "when John Slaughter was out alone trailing a criminal, he'd stop at my ranch house. Sometimes I'd hear a halloo at my door at night after I'd gone to bed, and it'd be old John after a cup of coffee. 'I'll make it for you, John,' I'd say, but he'd never let me. 'Go on back to bed,' he'd tell me, 'I'll make it.' And he'd rustle up a fire, and soon he'd have a pot of coffee boiling. When he had turned off a good hot cup, he'd walk out and get on his pony and ride away. He never talked none. I had hard work getting more'n yes and no out of him, and I never had the least idea where he was bound on these trips. Nobody else, I reckon, until he rides back to Tombstone. I remember I was working down my corral one day when a Mexican comes riding by on the purtiest black pony I ever seen. He was going along at a right smart gait, but I stops him. 'Say, partner,' says I, 'that's a right nice little hoss you're straddling. I kinder think I'd like to trade you out of him.' 'Está bueno, senor,' says the greaser. 'What have you to trade?' I offered to trade him an old spavined mule I owns, but he laughs at me, and I sees that Mex knows something about hoss-flesh. Well, we dickers quite a time. 'I'll tell you what I'll do,' says I at last. 'I'll give you them 2 hosses of mine you see right over yonder in that corral, and,' says I, $20 to boot.' That says this greaser thinking, and he looks like he's getting ready to trade when he seems to hear something back down the trail, and he turns around in his saddle and takes a long look. I don't see nothing, but whatever it is, it seems to make him kinder nervous, and he says he's in a sorter hurry just then and has got to be riding, but he'll see me some other time. So he gallops on off. But as I was telling you, that was just about the purtiest black pony I ever seen, and as he was riding away, I kept looking at that pony, and the more I looks at it, the prettier it seems to get. 'Now,' says I to myself, drawing my own conclusions about the greaser, 'that Mexican's done stole that animule, and he ain't got no business with it nohow, and I'm just going to have that black pony for myself, and that's all there is to that.' So I steps in the house and gets my rifle. If I takes a short cut across my alfalfa pasture, I can catch that Mexican by a clump of alamosas along the road. I was just starting when along comes John Slaughter. 'Seen a Mexican riding a black pony passing along here recent?' says John. 'Just left here about 5 minutes ago,' says I. 'Which away did he go?' says John. 'That away,' says I, and I pints up the valley toward the Mule Mountains. 'I ain't busy, John,' says I. 'Can I help you any?' 'No,' says old John, and he rides off. The next time I'm in Tombstone, they tells me Slaughter come riding back to town leading that black pony. Seems like the Mexican had stole it from Mrs. Amazon Howell, Slaughter's mother-in-law. I asked if Slaughter had brung in the Mexican. No, he hadn't. Then how'd he get the pony back, I asks. Well, nobody knowed. He'd brung the pony back, but he hadn't brung back no Mexican, and that's all they knowed about it. That struck me as kinder funny. I wondered whatever had become of that Mexican hoss thief. Of course, I didn't ask John. That had been a mistake. Nobody ever asked Slaughter no questions. It never did no good to ask him none, and sometimes it was sort of dangerous. About a week later, I reckon it was, I was riding over round the mouth of Bisbee Canyon looking for some cows when I notices a passel of buzzards sailing around over the mesquite, and I rides over to the spot. There lays this here Mexican that had come riding past my ranch on the black pony. I knowed him as soon as I seen him. So I goes on looking for my cows, which finally I rounds up and drives back home. And I never says nothing to nobody about what I sees in the mouth of Bisbee Canyon. I reckon it was 2 or maybe 3 months later I was in Bisbee. There was big excitement in town. Some cowpunchers had just found the skeleton of a human being lying out in the mesquite in the mouth of Bisbee Canyon. They'd brung in the bones and a few pieces of clothes they'd found at the spot, and the coroner was fixing to hold an inquest. I was kind of smiling to myself when I runs into old John Slaughter. 'They tells me,' says old John, 'some punchers had found a human skeleton over in the mouth of Bisbee Canyon,' says he. 'Yes,' says I, slapping him on the back and laughing. 'And,' says I knows what greaser used to own that skeleton.' 'Is that so?' says old John. 'Well,' says he, 'that Mexican won't never steal no more hosses.'" Juan Soto's case illustrates Slaughter's methods as neatly as anything that happened during his 2 terms in office. Juan Soto was a Spaniard who had come originally from California and was prosperously settled in Contention. He handled his affairs so adroitly as the leader of a band of robbers that operated up and down the San Pedro, running off cattle, holding up travelers on the highway, and committing an occasional murder, that the citizens of Contention had no suspicions that he was a criminal, but held him in great respect. Slaughter himself was in the dark for a long time as to Soto's connection with the thieves, though he often wondered where all the money came from that the Spaniard spent in lordly wise across Tombstone bars. Sheriff Slaughter had a deputy working for him named Bert Alvord, in whom he had great confidence, and who rewarded that confidence by shrewd, faithful service, though in after years he himself turned outlaw and engineered a number of daring train robberies. Alvord was a roistering good fellow who drank and gambled and made many friends in the shady walks of life. These friendships he cultivated assiduously for business reasons, being a good detective and having a good detective's faith in the value of stool pigeons. It was one of these secret informers who first directed Alvord's suspicions toward Juan Soto. But suspicion was one thing and evidence another, and Slaughter found it extremely difficult to fasten guilt definitely upon the crafty Spaniard. The sheriff learned that Soto was frequently away from his home in Contention all night on mysterious missions, and returned at dawn. He learned also that before coming to Arizona, Soto had been a member of a desperate band of criminals in California. While Slaughter was busy with his investigations, 2 cattle buyers were robbed and murdered near the Mexican line. Information he received left no doubt in the sheriff's mind that this atrocity was the work of Soto's band and that Soto himself had taken a personal part in it. Slaughter rode over to Contention and brought Soto back, a prisoner. Soto was acquitted at his trial in Tombstone. As he left the courtroom a free man, he smiled a sly smile of triumph in Slaughter's face, which, it may be remarked, was a tactical error. It was whispered that the jury had been bribed. That may or may not have been true. The evidence was strong, but there were certain missing links, and the jury had given Soto the benefit of what it deemed a reasonable doubt. But knowing what he did about Soto's clandestine affairs, Slaughter looked upon the verdict as an outrageous miscarriage of justice. Soto's guilt had not been proved to the satisfaction of the jury. Slaughter knew he was guilty. The jury of 12 men had brought in a verdict of innocence. The jury of 1 man returned a verdict of guilt. When, a few days later, Soto rode to his home in Contention at dawn after one of his nocturnal adventures, Slaughter stepped from a doorway with his pearl-handled 6-shooter at a level. "Soto," said the sheriff, "I'll give you 10 days to get out of the country." But the amazed Spaniard had other plans. He argued the matter. "The jury acquitted me," he objected. "My business is here in Contention. You've no right to order me out of the country." "The jury failed to put you in the penitentiary where you belong," replied Slaughter, "but I'll kill you if I catch you in this country after 10 days. That's your time limit. Remember, 10 days. Slaughter's peremptory order struck Soto as pretty high-handed, unjust also in view of his acquittal, and moreover unlawful. The sheriff had no right to order him out of the country, absolutely no right of any kind. Soto voiced his indignant resentment in Contention saloons. "I am Juan Soto," he said to his Mexican admirers, tapping himself upon the breast. "That fellow Slaughter thinks he is dealing with a baby, but I will show him." The 9th day arrived. Soto was tippling among sympathetic comrades. "Well, Juan," said one of his friends, "what are you going to do about it?" "Do?" flared Soto with a defiant laugh. "I am going to stay right here in Contention. I've just as good a right to stay in this country as Slaughter himself. He can't run me out." The sun of the 10th day shone brightly over Contention. Soto's Mexican comrades gathered in a saloon. They would have a social glass with Juan. He was in trouble. A drink or two would cheer him up. But Soto did not appear. His friends looked at one another with faint, dubious smiles. Juan had talked so big and brave the night before. It was unbelievable that, after all, he had obeyed the order of this fellow Slaughter. Ah, there down the street, Señora Juan Soto was sweeping off her front steps. The Mexicans would inquire, "Buenos dias, señora. ¿Adónde está Juan?" The woman, leaning on her broom-handle, gave a shrug. "Se fue," she replied. "Este es todo. Yo no sé por adónde." That was all. Juan Soto had vanished. It was a year later that a number of robberies were committed in Sulphur Springs Valley around Pierce. Juan Soto recently had settled in the valley. As that was not the San Pedro, he thought perhaps Slaughter would leave him alone. Then, doubtless, Slaughter had forgotten all about him. 12 months is a long time. Slaughter rode out of Tombstone alone one day, bound east. A few days later, he rode back. He had been over in Sulphur Springs Valley on a little business. That was all anyone ever learned from Slaughter. But Juan Soto suddenly and mysteriously disappeared. He never was heard of again in Sulphur Springs Valley, nor in Arizona, nor, as far as anyone knows, anywhere else. A rumor of unidentified origin spread abroad that Juan Soto was dead. Then there was Van Wyck Coster, at Wilcox. Slaughter gathered much evidence against Coster, who was a businessman of comfortable means and good reputation among unsuspecting citizens. Slaughter's evidence was enough, it was said, to send any ordinary person to the penitentiary, but Slaughter had had enough of courts and juries. His experience in the Soto case had taught him a lesson. He would take no more chances on a corrupt or misguided verdict. Then, why put the country to the unnecessary expense of a trial? Having tried and convicted Van Wyck Coster in his own mind, Slaughter rode over to Wilcox to pass sentence.
"But what the hell?" said Coster. "You can't run me out of this country. I've done nothing."
"I'll run you out, or I'll kill you," replied Slaughter. "I've got the goods on you, and have had 'em for a long time." Coster wriggled and squirmed. When Slaughter went into precise details concerning a number of crimes, Coster ceased to argue. It was exile or death. He had his choice. He wound up his business and departed. If an ordinary sheriff had tried to enforce such summary measures, the criminal probably would have laughed at him. But nobody laughed at Slaughter. The man he sentenced to exile or death knew Slaughter meant exactly what he said. The beauty of Slaughter's one-man jury verdicts was that they were always carried out one way or the other. Which way didn't make much difference to Slaughter. If the criminal preferred exile, all right. If he preferred to die, that was his business. Aguasarca was a huddle of mud huts on the northern Mexico and Arizona Railroad. Dark and silent on the night of May 11, 1888, lay the tiny village 12 miles south of Nogales on the border. Far off across the Sonoran Plains appeared a point of light. That was the express, a long-drawn, eerie, dreary whistle that seemed the voice of the desert's loneliness, came faintly out of the distance. As the train roared to a stop at the Aguasarca station, 2 highwaymen with drawn six-shooters climbed into the locomotive cab. The engineer kept to his seat at the throttle. The fireman seized the gun of the robber leader. This was a brave fireman, so a second bandit shot him dead. 4 other robbers on the ground were firing guns. The conductor came running from a rear coach with a lantern in his hand. What was the matter? A bullet cut through his heart. He lay there in the dark for an hour or more, his lantern on the ground beside him shining on his dead face. The express messenger was closing the sliding side door of his car when he was killed. Every phase of heroism received the accolade of a bullet this wild night. Now at their leisure the bandits rifled safe and mail sacks. Then they rode off. The hoofs of their horses in the darkness made fine, dashing music to which $15,000 marched away. But Jack Taylor, leader of the band, had lost his hat during the excitement. This bold fellow must have a hat. He stepped into a store in Nogales. He clapped a new hat on his head. Price? The clerk said only $3, in Mexican money at that. The court fixed the cost at the rest of his life in the penitentiary. Another robber, a German, was arrested with him. His imprisonment for life also sent the price of that hat a little higher. The other 4 robbers were Geronimo Miranda, Manuel Robles, Nieves de Ron, and one Federico, all Mexicans. They fled across the border to Tombstone. This was a dangerous refuge just then. The town's name had taken on a sinister significance for robbers under Sheriff Slaughter's regime. For 3 nights the sheriff and his men watched a Mexican woman's house, but the bandits got wind of the trap. They were next heard of at Wilcox and Clifton. Then their trail was lost. Guadalupe Robles, a brother of Manuel Robles, lived in Contention and was a dealer in firewood. He had a wood ranch in Frenchie's Canyon near Mescal Springs in the Whetstone Mountains. He would drive from Contention to the Whetstones one day, sleep at his camp that night, and return to town with a load of wood next day. Being a good, loyal brother, Guadalupe was kept under a surveillance which he did not suspect. One morning when he drove off for his camp, he had a gunny sack filled with food in his wagon. Of course Guadalupe must eat on his trips. He must have dinner, supper, and breakfast before he got back. But it struck the spies who were watching poor Guadalupe that a whole gunny sack full of food was a little too much even for the appetite of a healthy wood hauler. So Sheriff Slaughter was informed at once of the bountiful supply of refreshments Guadalupe was taking to Frenchie's Canyon. Whereupon Sheriff Slaughter and Deputy Sheriffs Bert Alvord and Cesario Lucero mounted in hot haste and rode for the Whetstones. Night fell moonless and dark. The Whetstones went up blackly into dim obscurity. Slaughter knew the location of Guadalupe's wood camp, but he and his men did not ride up Frenchie's Canyon. They hid their horses in thick brush, and on foot struck along the top of a heavily timbered ridge that parallels the canyon. They blundered through thickets, stumbled over rocks, bumped blindly into trees. Far back in the mountains, they waited for the peep of day. Far across the San Pedro Valley, the first faint suspicion of blue dawn appeared over the dragoons. The 3 men took off their boots, tied them over their shoulders with pieces of twine, and in their socks set off on the hunt. They slipped through the dark woods as warily and silently as Indians, guarding their steps lest the upsetting of a stone or the snapping of a twig give warning of their approach. Their quarry was not far away. They examined their guns, adjusted their cartridge belts. They were beginning to close in when Alvord showed sign of hanging back. Just a little. This was the young deputy's first big adventure. Slaughter caught him by the sleeve and swung him forward. "Stay there in front of me," whispered the sheriff. "If you run, I'll kill you." Before them, on the slope of a hill, they saw through the dim, misty light 3 forms rolled in blankets and stretched on the ground. Only 3. They had expected 5. The 3 sleeping men were Manuel Robles and Neves de Ron, robbers, and Guadalupe Robles, woodhuller guilty of nothing except loyalty to his scapegrace brother. Federico and Geronimo Miranda, the other 2 uncaptured bandits, had gone elsewhither. "Hey, roll out of those blankets and throw up your hands." Slaughter's voice cut through the dewy stillness. Called back perhaps from pleasant dreams, the 3 Mexicans flung aside their blankets, seized their 6-shooters which had been lying beside them, and leaped to their feet. Surely a wild awakening. No time to rub the sleep from their eyes, no time for anything but fighting, unless it was dying. There, almost upon them, were 3 grim spectre figures with leveled guns ready to send them to blazing death. Manuel Robles and Neves de Ron rose shooting. Guadalupe Robles, with his cocked 6-shooter in his hand, straightened to his full height. Slaughter's first shot killed him, and the Mexican crumpled down on his blankets and seemed to have gone back to his pleasant dreams. De Ron fled up the hill at a stumbling run and dodged behind an outcropping rock. There he turned at bay, only head and shoulders showing. 3 times his revolver flamed. A neat, rounded notch in Slaughter's ear dripped blood. One of Slaughter's bullets dropped De Ron, mortally wounded, behind the boulder. Manuel Robles went bounding down into the canyon. Alvord fired several shots at him, the balls knocking up spouts of dirt beyond him. "Pull down, Bert!" shouted Slaughter. "You're overshooting!" which might have seemed to indicate remarkably cool and keen observation on the part of the sheriff during the furious flurry of a battle. But Slaughter did not wait for his deputy to obey instructions. He gave a practical demonstration of how the shooting should be done. Turning his 6-shooter on Manuel, he sent the Mexican sprawling with the first shot, but Manuel was up in an instant. He ran a short distance when Slaughter's second bullet knocked him over once more. Again the Mexican scrambled to his feet and went scurrying away. This time he plunged into a thicket, and Slaughter's third bullet missed him just as he passed out of view. After the battle was over, Slaughter and his men trailed Manuel Robles 2 miles by his blood. Then his trail suddenly ended, and it was believed some Mexican had helped him to escape on horseback. De Ron was still alive. The wounded man and the dead man were carried back to contention in Guadalupe's wood wagon. While being taken to Nogales to be turned over to the Mexican authorities, De Ron died on the train, after confessing that he was the robber who had killed the locomotive engineer. Slaughter's ruthlessness in dealing with the train robbers who had wandered into his corner of the country caused the survivors of the band to plot vengeance. Learning that Slaughter was to visit San Bernardino Ranch, which he now owned, but which had not yet become his place of residence, Federico and an accomplice lay in ambush. Possibly Slaughter's guardian angel was on watch. At any rate, the sheriff did not make the trip he had planned. Deputy Sheriff Cesario Lucero went in his stead and rode into the trap that had been laid for Slaughter. The ambushed Mexicans fired upon Lucero, who, without a chance to fight for his life, was instantly killed. Federico and his companion escaped into Mexico, where they were captured several months afterward. Manuel Robles, wounded in the fight in the Whetstones, fled to Sonora, where he rejoined Geronimo Miranda, and word came back to Tombstone that the 2 outlaws finally met death in a battle with rurales somewhere in the Sierra Madre Mountains. Chacon, a Mexican bandit, had filled all the border country with the fame of his bold exploits. Sallying from his strongholds in the Sierra Madres with a troop of desperados at his back, this Fra Diavolo of Sonora sacked towns and haciendas, pillaged the stores of merchants, tortured citizens to make them divulge the places in which their wealth was hidden. He had killed many men, and his merciless ferocity had made him the terror of northern Mexico. Against Slaughter, this murderous robber had conceived a violent hatred. Up and down the frontier line he flung his boasts that if he ever met the sheriff, he would shoot him down like a dog. At these threats, Slaughter smiled grimly, but behind the smile was a purpose as deadly as Chacon's own. Slaughter, too, bided his time. For a year or more, the long-distance feud smoldered, but the trails of the 2 men did not cross. Then Slaughter received a warning direct from Chacon himself. "I am coming to Tombstone to kill you," the message said. The story of Chacon's visit to Tombstone was one of Bert Alvord's reminiscences of the sheriff. "I was sitting in my office in the courthouse one night," said Alvord, "when Slaughter came in with 2 double-barreled shotguns in his hands. His teeth were clenched, and his black eyes burned like points of fire. 'Take this gun and come with me,' he said, shoving one of the weapons in my hands. That was all until we reached the street. Then he stopped for a moment. 'Chacon is in town,' he snapped savagely. 'I'm going to get him.' I knew of the hatred between the two men, and I knew there was no man on earth Slaughter would rather kill than this Mexican bandit who so often had threatened to murder him. Slaughter led the way down into the deep gulch that runs back of the courthouse along the western edge of town. On a bluff at the side of this ravine stood a long house made of canvas stretched over a wooden frame. No light showed in the house, but we could see the white canvas dimly in the darkness. 'Chacon is in there,' said Slaughter. 'You knock at the front door. Chacon will run out the back door.' I waited until Slaughter had gone to the rear of the house. Then I stepped to the front door and thumped on it with the butt of my gun. I heard no movement inside, but while I was still knocking, the roar of Slaughter's shotgun shook the hills. I ran round to the rear. I say, I gave him both barrels," said Slaughter. "He pitched off into the gulch. He must be lying down there dead. We went back to the courthouse and got lanterns. Up and down the ravine we searched as carefully as prospectors looking for ore. But no Chacon could we find, dead or alive. Near the back door we found a taut wire that was one of the supports of the tent house. It was clear that, just as Slaughter fired, Chacon had tripped over this guy and plunged headlong down the embankment. The accident had saved his life. The double charge of buckshot had gone over his head. The Mexican had mounted his pony hidden in the gulch and escaped. The situation struck me as funny, but I looked as solemn as an owl. A sly chuckle just then would have been dangerous. Slaughter had been waiting for a year to kill Chacon, and he was wild with anger at his failure. This was the last chance he ever had. The Mexican had had enough of Tombstone and never came back. After it was all over, I went off where no one could see me and had a big laugh, all by myself." Bert Alvord long afterward took part in the capture of this murderous Mexican outlaw. Chacon's career ended on the gallows at Solomonville. John Slaughter was the last knight of Tombstone's Round Table. The succession of heroic men ended with him. His name is burned into the town's history as with a branding iron. He shines out as a type of competent, splendidly equipped frontiersman. Daniel Boone was not better fitted for Pioneer Kentucky than he for Pioneer Arizona. His mission was to clean up Tombstone, and he did a thorough job. He brought peace at the blazing end of a gun. He shot the town full of law and order. He is not classed as a bad man in the traditions of the Southwest, but no desperado was ever more feared than this inscrutable man who stood uncompromisingly for law and shot from the hip with amazing dexterity. He was a constructive force, building with a six-shooter, but building. While he was sheriff, there was law in Tombstone, even if the law, in large measure, was John Slaughter himself. When after 4 years of hard service he retired to his San Bernardino ranch to pass the remainder of his life, he left Tombstone as quiet as it is today. That is pretty quiet. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Tombstone, an Iliad of the Southwest by Walter Noble Burns. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Dale Barkley. Patchy. Dawn in the Sierra Madres. Purple darkness in the glens and twisting canyons. Ripples of faint daylight breaking in rows against the tallest peaks. Over the shadowy chaos of mountains, unutterable silence. Above the undulant flow of coldly gray summits, a formless, incandescent splash that was the morning star. For 10 years there had been peace between the white men and the Apaches. Geronimo and his warriors, who had of old terrorized and laid waste the frontier, had been deported to Florida. A handful of braves grown weary of inglorious peace had broken from San Carlos Reservation in May 1896 and left a black trail of burned homes and death along the upper waters of the Gila River and through the San Simon Valley. They had crossed into Mexico at San Bernardino Ranch and had found refuge in the fastnesses of the Sierra Madres, 50 miles below the international line. For 3 weeks, a troop of the 7th Cavalry had been in pursuit. At San Bernardino, the command had picked up John Slaughter to act as scout and guide. At 55, the eyes of the frontier manhunter were as keen as ever, and his knack at following a trail as uncanny as in old days. Working like a hound on the scent, he located the encampment of the Apaches perched on a bench high on a mountain. Day was breaking as the troopers stole through the pine forest. The Indian camp was asleep. The cracking of army carbines was reveille for the renegades. Bucks and squaws came tumbling from the little group of wickiups in the clearing. Into the woods they plunged in mad flight and scattered over the mountain like quail. The pursuit of the soldiers was useless. The Indians had vanished as by magic. The chase abandoned, the troopers returned to burn the village. John Slaughter stepped inside a wickiup. Something that, in the shadowy light, looked a little like a sack of flour caught his eye. Curious, he reached out the muzzle of his rifle to give the thing a poke. The sack of flour gave a sudden little tossing movement. It was a baby, a tiny Apache girl, perhaps a year old, fast asleep on a deerskin. Black hair was tousled on the little head. Long black eyelashes lay against the cheeks of dusky rose. The breath came and went as peacefully as if the child were sheltered in its mother's arms. All the noise of the attack and flight had left the baby's slumbers undisturbed. I say, crooned Slaughter, bending over. Wake up, little fellow. The baby girl opened her black eyes drowsily. A shadow of a smile flickered for an instant about her mouth. She probably expected to see her mother's face hovering above her. When she saw the black-bearded white stranger, her eyes filled with sudden terror. But no cry or whimper escaped her. She rolled off her deerskin, and like a baby wild animal taken by surprise, went scurrying off on all fours across the earth floor in a blind effort to escape. Well, baby, soothed Slaughter, you needn't be so scared. Nobody's going to hurt you. He caught up the little thing in his arms, wrapped her in an old shawl lying on the ground, and took her outside. Hey, fellows, what do you think of this? Soldiers gathered round, laughing. They peered into the frightened little face, patted the bronzed cheeks, shook the chubby hands, tugged playfully at the tiny bare feet. We'll all be good gosh darned. Hello, baby. Has your mother gone and left you, poor little baby? A rifle crackled behind a rock high on the mountainside. A bullet whizzed past the heads of the group and knocked up earth and stones nearby. An Indian, eh? Come prowling back. Several carbines made reply. No more shots came from the lone rifle on the mountain. A stalking party discovered an Apache buck lying dead behind the rock. The baby's daddy, I reckon. Come back to see what he could do for his kid. You've got to give it to that Indian. He loved his baby. Was ever a tiny daughter of Apaches in such tragic misadventure as this mite of a baby cuddling in Slaughter's arms? Abandoned by her people, captured as prize of war by the enemies of her race. Her father, probably, killed before her eyes. Her mother far off in the mountains, doubtless weeping out her heart. Now the soldiers were applying the torch. The infant's home was going up in flames. Still not a whimper from her lips. This baby was an Apache. What you going to do with the kid, Slaughter? Take her home. On the home trail, the baby slept beside Slaughter in his blankets. He woke one night and found her gone. He heard her rustle off in the darkness. The little Apache girl was crawling away silently through the grass. The starlit mountains had whispered, "Come back." She was going home. Her wild little heart had heard the call of the wild. So the Apache baby took her place as one of the family at the San Bernardino ranch. Mrs. Slaughter, having regard to the month, named her Apache May. But this was too big a name for such a mite. It was changed to Patchy. Civilization's first gift to Patchy was a bath, then some pretty new dresses. But Patchy's original clothes were preserved as curiosities, and very curious they were. Her entire wardrobe was on her back and consisted of only 2 pieces, an underwaist and a frock. But these had a history. The baby was clothed in the vestments of murder. Riding forth on their wild foray from San Carlos, the Indians of the band to which Patchy had belonged had attacked a ranch on the Gila River and massacred a Mormon family named Merrill, consisting of father, mother, and daughter. Farther south in the San Simon Valley, they had murdered a lone ranchman named Hand. Friends of the Merrills identified Patchy's underwaist as a part of the dart-fitted, many-buttoned, embroidered basque of the Mormon girl, and the shawl in which Slaughter had wrapped the baby as having belonged to the Mormon mother. Patchy's tight-fitting outer waist was made of a flour sack, and the little skirt attached to it was of white cloth of equally coarse weave. Patchy's frock was very dirty, but on the skirt, beneath the grime, Mrs. Slaughter noticed dark figures which she believed were elaborately wrought aboriginal ornamentation.
"These quaint markings, so dim with dirt, intrigue me," said Mrs. Slaughter. "They are probably a swastika pattern, or some sort of intricate scroll work, or picture writings. I imagine they must have some mysterious significance. I wish some Apache would ride this way who could interpret their meaning for me. Very probably Patchy's mother was, in her way, an artist." Profoundly interested in these cryptic designs, Mrs. Slaughter had Patchy's frock washed. After it had been soaked in a tub of suds, scrubbed on the washboard, and dried in the sun on the clothesline, the figures that adorned it stood out with startling distinctness. They read as follows: Republican ticket, delegate to Congress, Thomas F. Wilson. For joint councilman, J. W. Calkins. For representatives, Hicks, J. O. Stanford, J. S. Robbins, A. White, E. G. Norton. County Supervisor, H. G. Howe. Supervisors, J. Montgomery, B. S. Kaufman. Sheriff, S. H. Bryant. District Attorney, W. H. Stillwell. Treasurer, James P. McAllister. County Recorder, W. F. Bradley. It was laughable, of course, to think of little Patchy romping about the parental wickiup in the Sierra Madres clad in an old Cochise County election poster, identified by Arizona antiquarians as of 1888. But it was also tragic. The old poster had hung for years on the walls of Hand's cabin and had been carried off by the Apaches after the lonely rancher had been butchered. From the wickiup in which he found Patchy, Slaughter had also brought away a war bag and 2 papoose carriers. The war bag had been made from a pair of buckskin pantaloons, stitched with bright thread on a sewing machine, and probably once belonging to some Mexican dandy whom the Apaches had murdered. The papoose carriers consisted of a jacket attached to a headband. With the band across their foreheads, Apache mothers carried their babies in these jackets on their backs. Mrs. Slaughter tried carrying Patchy in one. She placed Patchy in the jacket so the child faced backward, and walked out into the sunshine. Patchy, she thought, would be delighted to be carried in the way her Indian mother used to carry her, but Patchy yelled and waved her chubby fists indignantly. "You've got her on wrong," said Slaughter. "The child must face the same way as you. That's Apache fashion." Mrs. Slaughter readjusted Patchy. Facing forward and steadying herself with arms and legs, the baby was as contented as a mouse in its nest. "Patchy was just a little wild animal when she came to San Bernardino Ranch," said Mrs. W. E. Hankin of Bisbee, who has preserved in manuscript much interesting history of the Slaughter family. "She ate anything, picking up scraps of food from the ground. When thirsty, she would run to a ditch, and lying face downward, drink from the stream. When drowsy, she curled up anywhere and went to sleep. When she became accustomed to her new home, she proved an unusually bright child. She understood much that was said to her. Sign language was natural to her. If she wanted bread and sugar, her signs were quite eloquent. She was soon lisping English. She forgot her Indian habits. In a little while she was eating from a plate, drinking from a cup, and sleeping in her own little bed. She was a vain little creature. She used to strut like a robin in the pretty clothes Mrs. Slaughter had made for her, and she was particularly proud of her long, thick black hair. Once, when her hair was cut off, she cried as if her heart would break. "All my pretty hair is gone," she wailed, but when her hair grew back more luxuriantly than before, she was vainer than ever. When she was 4 years old, an amateur photographer took her picture. The look of pride on her flat little face was comical as she sat before the camera after having carefully spread her hair out over her shoulders. There were other waifs who had found a home at San Bernardino, a little Mexican girl, a pickaninny as black as tar, and a freckled-faced American youngster. With these playmates, Patchy romped all day. She had nothing to do but play, and the years for the little wild girl passed like a happy dream. Above everything else in the world, Patchy loved Mr. Slaughter. She would toddle about the place, holding to the strap of one of his boots to steady her wavering feet. If he took her in his lap, she would sit serenely happy for any length of time. If he rode away, she would wait at the front gate for hours, watching patiently for his return. When she saw him far off, riding back, she would dance for joy. She called him Don Juan, and when Don Juan took her for a little ride over the ranch, as he often did, holding her on his saddle in front of him, Patchy reveled in the greatest happiness the world had to give. Caresses were not in Patchy's line. All the affection she had was expressed by her eyes, and she used to sit on the floor at the feet of her Don Juan as he smoked his pipe or read his paper, and gaze at him by the hour with the rapt expression of a pagan worshipper before an idol.
But the daughter of the wilderness and the white man's home remained an Apache. She had an instinct for ambush. She took delight in frightening feminine visitors at the ranch by slipping noiselessly through the house and suddenly appearing as if from nowhere. If, at her games, she hid from her playmates, her lithe body became as motionless as a rock on a hillside. Sometimes she had spells of silent anger when her baby face froze in hard, savage lines, and her black eyes snapped impishly. Though usually obedient, she could be sullen and obstinate. Once, when Mrs. Slaughter reprimanded her, the child's face twisted with rage.
"I'll kill you when I grow up," she flared.
Pessimists shook their heads over Patchy. They warned Mrs. Slaughter. They feared that the Indian in the child someday might flame into quick and possibly tragic savagery. A leopard, they sermonized, could not change its spots, and an Apache would never be anything but an Apache and a devil. 4 years after Patchy had come to the ranch, she was standing one February morning in 1900 beside a fire that she and her playmates had kindled, in front of the house. A gust of wind whipped her skirt into the blaze. Flames shot up and enveloped her. In panic, she ran down the road. Will Slaughter, John Slaughter's son, caught her after a chase, smothered the flames, and bore her in his arms into the house. She was put to bed, and soothing embrocations were applied. A telephone message was sent to Bisbee for a doctor. Bisbee, the nearest town, was 55 miles distant. Modern Douglas was not yet in existence, and it was 8 hours before the physician arrived. He found the case hopeless. Patchy suffered exquisite agony, but she did not writhe or scream or moan. She lay on her pillow silent and motionless, the courage and stolid fortitude of her race in her grim little face, only the look in her black eyes giving evidence of the torture she endured. The little Apache was approaching the end, like an Apache.
"Don Juan,"
she said to John Slaughter with womanly calmness,
"I am going to die. You have been good to me. Goodbye, Don Juan."
So Patchy went to join the ghosts of her fathers, leaving unsolved the riddle over which the learned of the world have pondered and argued for years. What effect would civilization have had in molding the character of this little savage of the Stone Age, nurtured among the refinements of a modern home? Would she have grown into the gentle womanhood of the white race, or into the hard, bitter maturity of her own wild people? Would she have been a lady or a squaw? Which would have won in her case, heredity or environment? San Bernardino Ranch was purchased by John Slaughter in 1884 and became his home in 1890. It was originally a land grant awarded in 1822 to Ignacio Perez by the government of Mexico and comprised 29,644 hectares or 73,240 acres. It lay entirely in Mexico until the Gadsden Purchase of 1853, which added an extensive border strip to the vast territory that had fallen to the dominion of the United States as a result of the Mexican War. Then the line as established between the two countries divided it into two unequal parts, the larger in Mexico, the remainder in Arizona. Slaughter bought the property from the descendants of Perez. In the days of Spanish dominion, a presidio garrisoned by Spanish soldiers stood at San Bernardino, guarding the northern frontiers of Mexico against savage Indian tribes. The mesa near the ranch house is still called the Mesa de la Avanzada, or the Mesa of the Advance Guard. Near the presidio, the pioneer Spanish padres established a mission. Crumbling adobe walls of a once extensive building in Mexico a mile south of the ranch house are believed to mark the site of this ancient religious house. 20 years ago, 2 Mexicans with pack burros camped for the night at these ruined walls. No one at the ranch paid any attention to them. Next morning, they were gone. But they had left exposed to view in the earth within the old cloister enclosure a deep box-like receptacle lined with cement from which had been removed a cement slab that had served as lid. The cavity was empty. What it had contained remained an enigma. The 2 strangers had plied pick and shovel only in this one spot, and it was evident they had worked with a chart or secret directions to guide them. The cement-lined receptacle, it was suspected, had been the treasure vault of the old padres. The old emigrant trail to California crossed the ranch land, and in the gold rush days of '49 was crowded with ox teams and prairie schooners. The ruts of the heavy wagons are still deep in the earth, and at a distance the old road shows as a distinct yellow line running for miles across the mesa east of the ranch house. Opening upon this mesa is Guadalupe Canyon, leading through the Guadalupe Mountains to the Animas Valley in New Mexico. It was in Guadalupe Canyon that Old Man Clanton and his 5 companions were ambushed and murdered by Mexicans, scene of the massacres of Mexican smuggler trains by Curly Bill outlaws. San Bernardino Ranch, intact today, is a domain of baronial extent. Its boundary fences are mountain ranges, its corner posts sun-kissed peaks. Watered by Guadalupe Creek and the Rio San Bernardino, it occupies the width of San Bernardino Valley and extends from the Guadalupe Mountains on the east to the Silver Creek Range on the west, and from the San Simon Valley watershed on the north to 6 miles south of the Mexican border. The international line is within a stone's throw of the front porch. Back of the barn lies Mexico. You may see a mule cropping grass in the United States, while its tail is busy switching flies in a foreign land. John Slaughter built a home here at San Bernardino worthy of a cattle king. About his long one-story adobe house with its deep, cool verandas, giant cottonwoods formed an oasis in the treeless valley. Like a little village were the great stables, granaries, workshops, and outhouses, with a commissary store for employees. Orchards and vineyards arose. 500 acres, irrigated by 7 artesian wells, yielded crops of corn, wheat, oats, barley, and vegetables. 30,000 cattle under Slaughter's brand pastured on the San Bernardino ranges. The hospitality of San Bernardino Ranch grew into a tradition. John Slaughter kept open house. Everybody was welcome. The family hardly knew what it was to sit down at a table without guests. Soldiers, statesmen, diplomats, frontiersmen, American cowboys, Mexican vaqueros, distinguished men and men undistinguished came and went in endless procession. When Douglas had boomed into a city 18 miles west, with Agua Prieta adjoining it across the border, house parties filled the ranch with gaiety almost every weekend. Men who were making history in Mexico rode over the line and sat at ease on the piazza while they discussed international adventures and problems with John Slaughter in Spanish, which he spoke as fluently as his native language. Among them were such notable persons as Madero, of tragic memory, Huerta, who rose on the ruins of Madero's fortunes, Pancho Villa, romantic bandit of the hills who fought his way to the capital at the head of a victorious army, and from the ancient palace which had been the home of viceroys and emperors, ruled supreme in Mexico, and Alvaro Obregon, who broke Villa's power at Celaya and Leon and sent him reeling back into the deserts from crushing and final defeat at Agua Prieta. Days of peace at San Bernardino brought out the kindly human side of John Slaughter's character. He loved children, and children loved him. The old frontier fighter was never happier than when sitting on the porch watching a troop of boys and girls at play. His grandchildren were constantly visiting at the ranch and brought their little friends. Slaughter made the little ones his companions, took them on horseback rides, bought them candy, harmonicas, and trinkets at the store, told them stories, fished with them in the creek, heaped their plates with good things at the table, and always sent them home with a silver dollar in their pockets.
Willie Green, 4 years old, Mr. Slaughter's grandchild, came to the ranch with a pocket full of marbles, said Mrs. Henkin, but it happened that just then no little boys were there with whom to play marbles. So Master Willie, being a shrewd merchant, offered his marbles to Mr. Slaughter for 5 cents. "That strikes me as a good bargain," said Mr. Slaughter, and he bought the entire stock. Then some boys arrived, and Willie needed his marbles. "I want my marbles back," he said to his grandfather, rather expecting to get them back for nothing. "All right," said Mr. Slaughter, "I'm always ready to trade. I'll sell them back to you for 10 cents. "But," argued Willie, "you got 'em for 5. "That's so," replied Mr. Slaughter, "but you must never go into a business deal unless you see that you can turn your money over at a profit." So Willie had to pay 10 cents to get his marbles back, but with the lesson that went with them, they were doubtless cheap at the price. Old Bat, who had come out from Texas with Slaughter, lived at San Bernardino until his death in 1921. A brave old Negro of lordly airs was Old Bat, and he looked upon himself as a member of the family. Of the ranch, cattle, and all Slaughter possessions, he used to say, "They belongs to us." In the old days, when Old Bat guarded the large sums of money carried on cattle-buying expeditions, Slaughter knew no robber would ever get the treasure without killing the Negro first. Old Bat was faithful to the last drop of his blood. Bat's courage shone out notably in an incident during one of Geronimo's raids in the San Bernardino country. Gus Hickey, Bunk Robinson, and George Bridges of Tombstone, prospecting in Guadalupe Canyon, were surprised by the Apaches. Robinson and Bridges were killed. Hickey entrenched himself behind a rock and fought for several hours. Deciding his only chance for life lay in flight, he left his hiding place and ran down the canyon in the open under the fire of the Indian guns. As by a miracle, he escaped without a scratch and reached San Bernardino Ranch, 18 miles away. The ranch hands talked of organizing a party to bring in the 2 dead bodies.
"Pshaw, what y'all talking about?" said old Bat. "Ain't no need for no party. I'll go fetch 'em in." He hooked up a team of mules and drove alone to the scene of the fight and brought in the bodies. As it chanced, Geronimo and his band had gone. Old Bat's last years were passed in important and busy idleness. Loyal to those who were loyal to him, Slaughter surrounded the old Negro with every comfort. Old Bat died at the ranch at the age of 90. He had been in Slaughter's service 43 years. Nigger John, who with old Bat had come from Texas on the Honeymoon cattle drive, had been a slave in the Slaughter family. As a pickaninny, he had been given by his mother on her deathbed to John Slaughter, and remained in his master's service for 25 years after slavery days had ended. He married in Tombstone and settled down in a home of his own. He still lives there, very old and in comfortable circumstances. Old age robbed John Slaughter of some of his restless energy, slowed his brisk step, caused him to stoop a little, and turned his hair and beard white, but it did not change his eyes. Some novelists have it, wrote Michael J. Phillips in 1921, that the man with the bright blue eye is the real article when it comes to brawls, battles, and ruckuses. Maybe so, but John Slaughter's eyes proclaim to me, without a word on his part, and without an effort on his part to impress me, that he is clear strain. They are black eyes, cold and unyielding as frosted granite. They are sharp. They probe you. His low voice and rather deprecatory manner are set at naught by one glance of those fearless eyes. So long as he lives, John Slaughter will never be merely one of the crowd in an assemblage. And it is because of his eyes. I would not care to be called on even today to shoot it out with John Slaughter, though he is a very old man. I asked him how much land he had here at San Bernardino. "About 100,000 acres, leased and owned," he replied in his drawly voice. He pointed to a mountain peak 6 miles below the international border which passed at our feet. "That's one boundary," he said. He pointed to another peak perhaps 10 miles from us and 6 miles from the first. "That's another. The American boundaries are over yonder." He flirted his thumb over his shoulder toward an empire's expanse of plains, hills, and mountains behind us. San Bernardino Ranch was steeped in peace on the night of May 4th, 1921. There was no moon, but the bonfire stars that blaze in Arizona skies gave a crystal clearness to the darkness. Mrs. Slaughter, Miss Edith Stowe, a guest, and Jess Fisher, foreman of the ranch and Mrs. Slaughter's cousin, were talking in desultory wise in the living room. John Slaughter sat in the dining room, absorbed in a newspaper. The window beside him looked out upon the commissary store 30 feet distant across the backyard. The window shade was raised. A kerosene lamp of great brilliancy lighted the room. Suddenly, one of Slaughter's old-time, unaccountable mystic warnings of unseen danger flashed upon him. He flung aside his newspaper and hurried from the room. His bedroom across the hall was dark. He stepped into it. He had no reason for doing this. He had neither heard nor seen anything out of the common. He did it, that was all. As his fingers closed on the handle of his six-shooter lying in its place on the chimney-piece, 2 shots sounded loudly at the rear of the house. He rushed for the door. Feeble with age, he was the fighter still. But Mrs. Slaughter and Miss Stowe threw their arms around him and bore him into a chair. "You must not go outside," screamed Mrs. Slaughter. "You will be killed." Jess Fisher had heard a noise at the store. He had stepped out to investigate. Immediately had come the crash of 2 guns. Whatever was taking place, it was quickly over. Running footsteps faded into the distance. Then silence. Slaughter and the 2 men found Fisher lying dead on the little platform in front of the door of the store. His pockets were turned inside out, and his watch was gone. $80 was missing from the cash drawer of the commissary. From the bunkhouse, Manuel Garcia and Jose Perez, employed on the ranch, had disappeared. 4 Mexicans, it developed, had been concerned in the robbery. Garcia and Perez were caught next day at a neighboring ranch. Garcia, 19 years old, had lived on the Slaughter ranch since boyhood. Perez, who had been in Slaughter's employ only a few days, was said to have served with Pancho Villa's guerrillas. Arcadio Chavez, taken in Agua Prieta with Fisher's watch in his possession, made a clean breast and implicated Manuel Rubio as the 4th man. The robbers, Chavez said, had planned to murder the entire family at the ranch and loot the place. He and Rubio had shot Fisher. If Slaughter had come running out, as they expected, they would have killed him. But as the old fighter had been saved from the trap, the fear of his 6-shooter, Chavez declared, prevented the carrying out of the plan for wholesale murder. Garcia and Perez were sent to the penitentiary for life. Rubio was never apprehended. Chavez, it was reported, went through a form of trial at Hermosillo in Mexico and was acquitted. Manuel Garcia, according to Chavez, had planned the robbery. His murderous treachery was a shock to Mrs. Slaughter. He had been her personal chore boy, and she had taken a mother's interest in his bringing up. Slaughter's life was saved that night by his mysterious warning. His murder was to have been the crux of the plot. If he had continued a minute longer to read his newspaper by the window in the brilliantly lighted dining room, he unquestionably would have been killed. His lifelong confident assertion that he could not be killed seemed to have been verified again. Now, near the close of his career, his guardian angel was still on watch. Slaughter's last years were as serene as the sunlight that bathes the San Bernardino Valley. He lived in peace and contentment. He rode occasionally. He pottered in his kitchen garden. He walked among his flower beds, bringing a fresh rose every morning to lay beside his wife's plate on the breakfast table. He sat on the pleasant veranda in the long languorous afternoons and watched the cloud shadows drift across the Vegas or let his eyes rest on the shadowy beauty of the blue mountains of Mexico. His 80 years of life, that from first to last had been one long romance of the frontier, ended from apoplexy February 15th, 1922. He had done his work well and had earned his rest. No more forceful or picturesque character ever made history in Pioneer, Arizona than this John Slaughter, who, carrying law in one hand and a six-shooter in the other, established peace and prosperity in his corner of the wilderness of the Southwest. End of Chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Tombstone, an Iliad of the Southwest by Walter Noble Burns. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Dale Barkley. Hands up. Bisbee is a city, you might say, of only one dimension, length. It lies like a piece of string along the bottom of a narrow canyon in the Mule Mountains. Its main street, in the bed of the winding slit, is miles long, with handsome business blocks near the middle of the thread and good-looking residences out at the ends. Of course, if one wishes to be precise, there is a little width and a little height to the town, and the height up the canyon walls is about as great as the width across the canyon. The residences hang on the steeps as if glued there. A businessman going home to lunch journeys straight up by a series of ladder-like steps that bear street names. If you enjoy mountain climbing, Bisbee will appeal to you as an ideal place of residence. If you happen to be fat, you will fall into a panic at mere sight of the town. Under the main street is a giant subway to drain off the water when it rains. After a storm, the water roars through the subterranean sluice like an express train and flows out in a spreading flood on the plains at the south end of the canyon. It is surprising what a seething torrent the tiny drops of a light rain will form when they trickle down the mountainsides and merge at the bottom of the canyon. If it were not for this subway, a light shower might wash the town away. Right in town at the edge of the business center is the Copper Queen Mine. It seems, in a way, to merge with the stores. You pass a soda fountain and a haberdashery shop with windows full of shirts, and come to one of the richest copper mines in the world. Crushed in between its mountain walls, this bizarre little city of 22,000 people is the metropolis of southeastern Arizona. 26 miles north is Tombstone. An equal distance south are Douglas and the Mexican border. Bisbee, with its schools and churches and wealth and culture, has traveled a long road since its boom days as a mining camp in the early 80s when copper was struck in the Mules. Then it was a rough town full of boozing cans and brothels and dance halls, and Brewery Gulch was famous as a rendezvous for hard characters from the four corners of the frontier. But it was a busy, money-making place, too, and from the first it grew steadily and solidly. It was like a piece of string in that yesterday of long ago, as it is today, and its one-story frame business houses and shanty saloons were strung out up and down the canyon in twin rows along its single winding street, while the mountainsides were plastered with the precariously clinging pine shacks of miners. Among the merchandising establishments of that pioneer time, none did a more flourishing business than the general store of Goldwater and Castañeda. Dan Dowd and Red Sample, rough-looking customers in their cowboy paraphernalia, stood in front of Goldwater and Castañeda's store at 7:30 o'clock on the night of December 8, 1883. The Christmas shopping season was in full swing, and Bisbee's main street was bright with street lamps and the light shining from store windows. "All set?" asked Dan Dowd out of the corner of his mouth.
"Yep,"
replied Red Sample.
"then let her rip."
Whereupon these two hard-looking customers slid 6-shooters from the scabbards at their sides, and one shot up the street and the other shot down. The street, a moment before, had been, in a manner of speaking, full. A moment afterward, the street, as you might say, was empty. Shoppers on the sidewalk ran into the stores. Shoppers in the stores, though curious, stayed there. Dan Dowd kept on firing up the street, and Red Sample kept on firing down. As their bullets were singing Christmas carols on the sidewalk, 3 friends and business associates, Tex Howard, Bill Delaney, and Dan Kelly, were inside the store doing their Christmas shopping with 6-shooters. While proprietors, clerks, and customers stood lined along the walls with hands in the air, the trio rifled the cash drawers, ransacked the safe, looted the showcases of watches and jewelry, and scooping everything into a sack, rejoined their companions in the street. Meanwhile, Dan Dowd and Red Sample had been having a busy time. When their first shots had sent the street crowd scurrying, John Tappener had been a little slow in getting inside a saloon, and a bullet knocked him over dead in the barroom door. Mrs. Anna Roberts, a restaurant keeper, was slain accidentally, it was said, with a bullet meant for a fugitive man. J. A. Nolly was wounded and lay crumpled on the sidewalk, dying later. Deputy Sheriff D. Tom Smith and James Kriegbaum, indignant that 5 bandits should overawe an entire town of able-bodied citizens, stepped out in the street and for a while turned the one-sided affair into a battle. Smith was quickly killed. Kriegbaum wounded Red Sample in the arm. With 3 citizens dead and 1 dying, the 5 robbers swung on their horses and went galloping down the canyon, terrorizing the lower town with revolver shots. When they rode out of the mountains at the south end of the canyon, they turned east and headed across Sulphur Springs Valley for the Chiricahuas. This affair was known in the chronicles of the period as the Bisbee Massacre. While the rattle of shots in the lower canyon was still in his ears, Kriegbaum leaped on his horse and in a mad Paul Revere ride across the mountains, reached Tombstone in an hour and a half. Automobilists who travel the up-and-down road today think they are doing pretty well if they cover the distance in 50 miles. Kriegbaum's news threw Tombstone into a furor. Deputy Sheriff William Daniels and a posse were soon riding hard for Bisbee. They found the mining town wild with excitement, its streets swarming with armed men. Several posses were already out scouring the country. A number of citizens joined Daniels, among them John Heath. Heath had been stirred to the depths of his soul by the red-handed atrocity. Among all the voices lifted against the perpetrators, his was the loudest.
"Damnable outrage," he declared. "Them fellers deserve no mercy. Track 'em down. Hang 'em to the nearest tree. Them's my sentiments."
Where the trail of the robbers turned east at the south end of the canyon, Heath led the posse south.
"Here's the trail, boys," he shouted. "They're heading for Mexico."
The posse clattered after this lynx-eyed fellow who could read a trail in the dark. Close to the Mexican line, Heath turned west.
"This way, boys," he called out. "The trail's getting hot. We'll catch them fellers before noon, you bet."
When morning came, Heath was spurring hard on a trail no one else could see. But no criticism of John Heath, mind you. This honest lad was plainly doing the best he knew how. The posse thought he was wrong, that was all, and back it rode to the mouth of the canyon. Now that it was daylight, the trail of the robbers was plain. It led east. Somewhere around Soldier Holes in Sulphur Springs Valley, Heath announced that the trail turned north. The others saw that it still ran east. Again Heath was overruled, but merely with deprecatory smiles. He meant well. His mistake was evidently due to his over-anxiety to catch them robbers and string 'em up. Before the posse reached the Chiricahuas, Heath attempted to lead it off on several other false scents. Vague suspicion gradually took form. It began to look as if a pretty crafty gambler was overplaying his hand. In the Chiricahuas, the 5 horses the robbers had ridden were found dead at the bottom of a chasm. When the animals had given out from hard riding, the bandits had driven them over a precipice after stealing fresh mounts from a ranch. The tragedy of the 5 horses was a heartless piece of deviltry. The animals could have been turned loose with no danger to the robbers. A little deeper in the mountains, the pursuit ended. The fugitives had scattered. When Heath had returned to Bisbee, he was still vociferous in anathema.
"Them bandits didn't have no call to kill citizens the way they'd done," he said. "If I'd run onto 'em, I'd shot 'em down like dogs."
After one of these tirades, Frank Buckles measured Heath with cold eyes.
"Those 5 fellows," said Buckles, "stopped at my ranch in Polbridge Canyon 2 nights before the robbery. And Mr. Heath," he added, "you were with them."
Heath was arrested and placed in jail at Tombstone. It was established later that he had planned the robbery. Just a shade too much of enthusiasm had landed Heath in the shadow of the gallows. Deputy Sheriff Daniels traced Dan Dowd into Chiricahua. The two men met one day on the street of Corralitos, a little mining town in the Sierra Madre Mountains. "Hello, Dan," said Daniels. "Hello, Bill," said Dowd. But Daniels spoke over the barrel of a .44, and Dowd returned the greeting with his hands in the air. Extraditing a criminal from Mexico was slow work in those days. So Daniels smuggled his prisoner across the line, and Dowd was soon in a cell in Tombstone. Delaney was arrested in Minas Prietas in Sonora by a Mexican officer. Without extradition papers, Daniels brought the prisoner over the border in a boxcar. Kelly was arrested in Deming in a barber's chair while his face was covered with lather. The barber had identified him by a photograph. Red Sample and Tex Howard arrived in Clifton with plenty of money and cut a splurge in underworld resorts. Howard, in princely fashion, bestowed a gold watch upon a woman. Vain of the gift, the siren exhibited it to an admirer who examined it with eyes green with jealousy, but not too green to identify the timepiece by description sent broadcast as having been part of the loot of the Bisbee massacre. So the enamored Howard did not bask long in beauty's smiles. The jealous lover betrayed him, and Howard and Red Sample, shackled hand and foot, took the trail for Tombstone. Dowd, Sample, Howard, Kelly, and Delaney were tried together before Judge D.H. Pinney in Tombstone and sentenced to hang. Their execution was set for March 28th. Heath, tried separately, was convicted of murder in the second degree, and on February 21st sentenced to life imprisonment. Bisbee had viewed the hanging verdict for the 5 robbers with deep-seated satisfaction, but it burst into a storm of rage when it learned that Heath had escaped the gallows. A mass meeting was held. Citizens thundered indignation. Resolutions were passed. And next morning, while the dawn of Washington's birthday was red over the mule summits, a committee of 50 Bisbee men, mounted and armed, rode over the divide on the road to Tombstone. Tombstone had hardly rubbed the sleep out of its eyes when the Bisbee horsemen rode into town. The streets were empty. Only a few stores had opened. A few housewives cooking breakfast caught a glimpse of the cavalcade. A few drowsy citizens drawing on their trousers stared out the windows wonderingly as it passed. The Bisbee men dismounted at the courthouse. A knock sounded on the iron portal of the jail. Swinging open the door, Sheriff Ward looked into the barrels of several six-shooters. "Well," he gasped in astonishment, "I thought it was the Chinamen bringing breakfast for the prisoners." Sheriff Ward surrendered the keys, expecting a wholesale lynching. But Heath alone was taken from his cell. The 5 robbers under sentence of death were in adjoining cells. They were relieved when the committee paid no attention to them. They were justly doomed. These men of Bisbee had come to do justice in the single case in which they were convinced the court had erred. Heath, in their opinion, was as guilty as the others. He, too, deserved to die. Heath was led to a telegraph pole north of the courthouse in Toughnut Street. He stood there in the early morning sunlight, as cool and unperturbed as if being lynched were habitual before breakfast routine, like lemon and hot water or orange juice. "Got anything to say before you go, Heath?" "I wish," replied Heath, "you'd promise not to shoot my body full of holes after you swing me up." "All right, we'll promise you that." Heath drew a red bandana from his pocket and bound it around his head so that it hid his face. A hanging had certain punctilios of etiquette to be observed. It was the correct thing for men who went into the other world at a rope's end to depart with their faces covered. His handkerchief took the place of the official black mask. When the noose had been slipped about his neck, he sensed a certain ineptness. He was fastidious in this matter of dying. "Shove the knot around under my left ear," he said through his handkerchief. "Thank you," he acknowledged politely, when his request had been complied with. The Bisbee horsemen rode out of town as quietly as they had come. Perhaps not 50 people in Tombstone knew that anything unusual had taken place. Citizens going to their work saw with surprise a dead man hanging 20 feet in air against the telegraph pole in Toughnut Street. They noticed curiously a placard fastened just below his feet. It read, "John Heath was hanged to this pole by the citizens of Cochise County for participation as a known accessory in the Bisbee Massacre at 8:20 a.m., February 22nd, 1884, Washington's birthday." The Heath lynching resulted in a famous coroner's verdict. The jury was confronted with a delicate problem. The usual verdict of death at the hands of parties unknown was impracticable. All the lynchers were known, but the jury had no intention of naming the parties at whose hands death had occurred. Tombstone heartily approved the hanging bee. Dr. George Goodfellow in his testimony hinted at a way out of the dilemma. He declared death had been caused by emphysema. The jurors had not the slightest idea what emphysema meant, but they caught at the learned word as drowning men at a straw. Dr. Goodfellow explained that emphysema was swelling caused by air in the cellular tissues and was sometimes due to strangulation and sometimes to the effects of high altitude. What more could any honest jury want? The verdict read, "We, the jury of inquest, impaneled and sworn by the coroner of Cochise County, after viewing the body and hearing the testimony, find that the name of the deceased was John Heath, 32 years old, a native of Texas, and that he came to his death from emphysema of the lungs, which might have been, and probably was, caused by strangulation, self-inflicted or otherwise, as in accordance with the medical evidence." A gallows built for 5 stood back of the Tombstone courthouse. The high board fence about the yard shut it off from the view of the public. A thrifty citizen erected a grandstand from which the hanging might be witnessed. There seemed prospect of his making considerable money. One morning, when he went to put the finishing touches on the structure, he found it a mass of wreckage. Tombstone did not approve of turning the tragedy into a box-office attraction. 2 miners sat on the dump of the Lucky Cuss mine on the hill back of town. Far below they could see the courthouse yard, the yellow pine gallows, the strong crossbar above it, the 5 dangling hempen nooses. The door of the jail opened. Dowd, Sample, Howard, Kelly, and Delaney walked out, herded by deputies, Sheriff Ward at their head. The little procession crossed the yard and mounted the gallows stairs. The 5 condemned men took their places in line on the trap.
"I've known all them boys well," said one of the miners on the Lucky Cuss dump. "Fine fellers if you'd want to meet."
"Hard to understand," remarked the other. 5 husky young fellers, full of life this minute, dead as this chunk of rock 5 minutes from now.
Had many a drink with them boys. Been to the birdcage with them. Sat in poker games with them. Sure was nice boys.
Looked like soldiers standing up there. Heads up, shoulders back. Game, all right.
Yes, sir, knowed 'em well. Sat and talked with them many's the time, just like I'm setting here talking to you. Dan Dowd played as purty a game of bank as you ever seen. Sure knowed how to handle chips.
What are them deputies doing?
Stropping their hands behind their backs and stropping their ankles together. That's the way they do. Old pals of mine, all them fellers. Spent their money free. Many's the...
That's the black caps, ain't it? They're slipping on the nooses. The sheriff's shooting them knots tied agin their necks. What's that deputy stepping back to the rail fur?
He's going to cut the string. Good night. There she goes.
God!
Done dropped 'em through. Well, I'll be damned. Just to think I knowed all them boys well. Yes, sir, knowed 'em well.
Can't see 'em. Can't see nothing but a black slit in the floor of the gallows.
Just a black slit. That's all. And black as hell.
Into the blackness 5 men had dropped to death. The Bisbee massacre had been expiated. Train robberies came into vogue among Arizona outlaws in the 90s. Lonely deserts, convenient mountains, and trains bearing fortunes in their safes made the crime attractive. Train robberies at Canyon Diablo, Maricopa, Rock Cut, Wilcox, and Steins Pass were pioneer successes for daring spirits to emulate. Black Jack Ketchum was one of the most famous of these early-day robbers. After robbing a bank at Nogales, he killed a man of Sheriff Fly's pursuing posse at Skeleton Canyon, adding one more tragedy to the many tragedies of that famous pass in the Peloncillos. Black Jack, it was supposed, buried much of his loot in a cave in Wildcat Canyon at the south end of the Chiricahuas, near William Letley's ranch. He called this cave Room 44. Captured after a train robbery, Black Jack imparted to Leonard Alverson full directions as to how to lift this treasure. But unfortunately, Alverson had no opportunity to go on a treasure hunt, being detained behind bars at Yuma. Falling heir to Alverson's information, Bert and Harry Massia of Tombstone ransacked Room 44, but no doubloons or pieces of 8 rewarded them. Black Jack, a Falstaffian robber much given in prosperous days to fat capone and flagons of sack, was sentenced to hang at high noon in Clayton, New Mexico. On the galleys he appeared anxious. "What time is it?" he asked. He was told it lacked 1 minute of 12. "Well, hurry up," urged Black Jack. "I'm due to eat dinner in hell at 12 sharp." The drop, it is said, severed the giant's head from his body. They still laugh in Arizona at the Silver Rain train robbery at Wilcox in 1895. Grant Wheeler and Joe George, the bandits, found $60,000 in Mexican silver dollars stacked in sacks in the express car. This money was too bulky to carry away, and they used it to weigh down the dynamite they placed against the safe. The explosion wrecked the car. The dollars went flying through the roof and on toward the stars, and fell in a silver rain over all the landscape. Telegraph poles were shot full of coins, which later were scraped off like barnacles, and a pile of cross ties beside the track was turned into a silver mine. Searchers worked for days picking up the money, some of the silver pieces being found a half-mile from the railroad. And strangely enough, all but $600 was recovered. The two robbers got only $1,500 from the safe, and were trailed by bills with corners singed off, which they spent in saloons during their flight. Joe George was caught and sent to Yuma. Billy Breckenridge, Sheriff Behan's famous deputy, who was now Detective William Breckenridge of the Southern Pacific Railroad, tracked Grant Wheeler to Mancos, Colorado. There, when the robber was cornered without hope of escape, he blew out his brains. Bert Alvord, Sheriff Slaughter's old deputy, was living during this period at Wilcox. He owned a cattle ranch, took a hand in politics, and had been elected constable. But he was the same genial, roistering, devil-may-care fellow as in old Tombstone days, and everybody liked him. Living in Wilcox, too, was William Downing, a cattleman reputed rich and looked upon as an honest, substantial citizen. But Downing had been a member of the notorious Sam Bass band of outlaws in Texas, had served 2 terms in the penitentiary, and had been run out of Texas by the Rangers. Downing and Bert Alvord became friends, and this sinister friendship marked the turning point in Alvord's career. The Southern Pacific Express, westbound, was robbed at Cochise, southwest of Wilcox, in September 1899. 2 men flagged the train at midnight, overawed the train crew with 6-shooters, dynamited the safe, and escaped with $10,000. Sheriff Scott White, with a posse, of which Bert Alvord was a member, pursued the robbers into the Chiricahuas, where the trail was lost. No clue to the identity of the bandits was discovered. They had vanished into mystery, and the Cochise robbery passed into history as one of the most skillfully managed criminal enterprises that had ever occurred in Arizona. It was not until 6 months later that Jeff Milton turned the light of a blazing shotgun on the secret history of this interesting affair. Jeff Milton of Fairbank, a famous fighting man of the Tombstone country, was born in Florida in 1861. He has been a part of the Southwest since his youth, as Texas Ranger, Chief of Police of El Paso, Cattle Association detective, railroad detective, and shotgun messenger, and for years immigration agent and customs inspector along the border between Arizona and Mexico. Gray of hair and mustache, the old fire-eater is still a gallant figure, and for all his years on the frontier, still retains the manners, speech, and kindly courtesy touched with a certain courtliness that belonged to the tradition of the Old South. The train from Nogales to Benson pulled into Fairbank at dusk on a February day in 1900. Jeff Milton, express manager, was leaning in the doorway in the side of the express car, his shotgun in the crook of his arm. He smiled when he saw a half-dozen citizens lined up on the station platform, with 2 cowboys behind them with drawn 6-shooters. The idea of a train robbery did not occur to him. It was pretty dark, and he thought the cowboys, half tipsy perhaps, were having fun with some tenderfeet. He chuckled aloud when one of the cowboys shouted, "Get up your hands!" But when he saw a cowboy using the row of citizens as breastworks point a 6-shooter in his direction, he woke up. That gun looked a little like business. Maybe, after all, this was the real thing. "Come out of that car!" yelled the cowboy. "If there's anything in this car you want," Milton flung back, "come and get it." Flame leaped from the cowboy's gun. The bullet shattered the bone in Milton's arm and knocked him over on the car floor. The cowboy rushed for the door. He was climbing in the car when Milton got to his knees, one arm dangling like a rag, and raising his shotgun with one hand, fired. The robber tumbled back on the ground with a load of buckshot in his body. "Look out, boys!" he shouted. "This fellow's shooting to kill. He's got me." "I slammed the door shut and locked it," said Milton. "Then, as there was no way for those fellows to get in unless they dynamited the car, I staggered over to a piece of baggage and sat down. An orchestra began to play. Thinks I, that's the most beautiful music I ever heard in my life. The next thing I knew, a setter pup was licking me in the face, and Baca, the engineer, was standing over me." Milton's heroic duel saved a valuable treasure in the safe and ended the train robbery. The man he had shot was 3-fingered Jack Dunlap, The other bandits were Bravo John Yos, Bob Brown, and Jack and Lou Owens. Three-Fingered Jack was being held in the saddle when the robbers rode off in the darkness. Milton was rushed in a caboose drawn by a special engine to Tucson, where surgeons removed several inches of bone from his upper arm. The wound left him a cripple for life. Sheriff Scott's posse found Three-Fingered Jack, half dead and abandoned by his comrades, at Buckshot Springs in the Dragoons, and took him to Tombstone, where he was placed in the hospital. Bob Brown and the two Owens brothers were arrested a few days later. Bravo John was taken at Cananea in Mexico. Three-Fingered Jack died 6 days after his capture. On his deathbed, he told the story of the Cochise train robbery. Bert Alvord and William Downing, he declared, had planned the crime. Billy Stiles, a constable at Pierce, and Matt Burtz, a cowboy, had committed the robbery. Alvord, Downing, and Stiles were soon in jail at Tombstone, and Burtz was arrested in Wyoming. For a time, Wilcox and Tombstone refused to believe two such respectable citizens as Alvord and Downing were implicated in a train robbery. Then Billy Stiles confessed. He and Burtz, Stiles said, had turned over the $10,000 taken at the robbery to Alvord and Downing. These masterminds of the conspiracy, according to Stiles, had made a masterful decision of the spoils, giving Stiles only $480 as his share. This niggardliness had rankled with Stiles, and his confession was the outcome of the grudge he had nursed. But having betrayed his accomplices, Stiles suffered from remorse. Permitted a certain amount of liberty as a state's witness, he held up the Tombstone jailer, whom he shot in the leg, and getting possession of the keys, released Alvord and Bravo John. Arming themselves with guns taken from the sheriff's office, the three men rushed from the jail. At the door they met Matt Burtz, back from Wyoming in custody of a deputy sheriff. Burtz joined them, and the four outlaws galloped out of town on stolen horses. Downing had refused to join in the jailbreak. Stiles, Bravo John, and Burtz were recaptured, and after 2 years of liberty spent in Sonora, Alvord surrendered to Sheriff Del Lewis, an old friend, at Naco. But tiring of imprisonment, Alvord and Stiles escaped from the Tombstone jail a second time in 1903 by tunneling through the walls. Both were recaptured, and at last all the men concerned in the Cochise and Fairbank robberies went to Yuma prison. Stiles was killed in Nevada in 1908 by outlaws whom, it is said, he was planning to betray. Downing was killed by Territorial Ranger Speed at Wilcox the same year. Bravo John passed into oblivion in Mexico. After serving 2 years in the penitentiary, Alvord went to Honduras, where it was said he married a wealthy coffee planter's daughter, and where, according to word that came back to Tombstone, he died in 1912. Jeff Milton, George Scarborough, and Eugene Thacker had trailed Bronco Bill Waters, Bill Johnson, and Jack Pitkin into the White Mountains in northeastern Arizona, and were in camp at McBride's Crossing on the headwaters of Black River. The three fugitives had robbed a Santa Fe train at Belen, New Mexico, and killed 3 men of a sheriff's posse that had gone out from Socorro. "I was fishing near camp," said Milton, "and had landed several nice trout when I heard firing. Bronco Bill and his 2 pals had given us a little surprise. I stuck my fishing bowl in the bank and slid my Winchester off my shoulder. I saw Johnson churning his gun behind a juniper 200 yards away. I clipped him in the hip. The bullet split against the bone, and we buried him next morning. Bronco Bill, who had been fighting from the ground, jumped on his horse. 'Hold on, Cap,' I called to him. 'I've got a little business I want to talk over with you.' But he didn't stop until I knocked him out of the saddle with a bullet. Pitkin got away. After serving 20 years in the penitentiary, Bronco Bill was pardoned out only a couple of years ago. I met him in Naco. He didn't look much like the bold, bad train robber I had once nearly killed. He was white-haired and stooped and feeble. Old age," added Milton philosophically, "seems to treat us all alike. I felt kind of sorry for the old devil." End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Tombstone, an Iliad of the Southwest by Walter Noble Burns. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Dale Barkley. Sunshine and Peace. Tombstone, that in its days of glory as the metropolis of Arizona had 15,000 people, had dwindled to a ghost town in 1900 when only 646 inhabitants stood between it and utter extinction. But the old town refused to die. It rallied in its last ditch. It added 500 to its census roll in the next quarter of a century. It now has a population of about 1,200. So you see, Tombstone is growing. Tombstone is a pretty live little town. You wouldn't think so to look at it, but it is. You must be careful to distinguish between the physical town and the people who inhabit it. The buildings are of the dead past, the people of the live present. There is much public spirit. The town has its commercial club. The businessmen get together at a luncheon every week. The welfare and improvement of the town are always uppermost. Tombstone is on a coast-to-coast motor highway. Cars go through by the hundred every day. The historic associations interest these travelers, whose flying trade is of great annual value. Camps have been established. Tourists are made welcome. To increase interest in Tombstone, it is planned to turn the old Birdcage Theater into a museum, to be filled with mementos of the town's early history, which would seem an excellent idea. The town's isolation is an element deterrent to its development as a business or manufacturing center, but the citizens hope in time to build it into a great health resort, for which its situation might seem ideal. Its winters are spring-like, and because of its elevation, it is immune from the intense summer heat which prevails in some other sections of Arizona. It has an abundant supply of cold water, piped from springs in the Huachucas. Its air is pure and dry, its glorious sunshine perennial, and about it is the beauty of deserts and mountains. The business section of Tombstone is much as it was in early days. The one-story buildings with wooden awnings shading the sidewalk are the same that Wyatt Earp and Johnny Behan knew. The old Oriental, where Doc Holliday dealt faro and Buckskin Frank tended bar, is a drugstore, and dainty young women gossip over ice cream sodas where hard-eyed gamblers once bucked the tiger. The Crystal Palace is empty. Dust covers the windows through which in old days could be seen the Monte tables piled with gold and silver money, the roulette and faro games surrounded by eager throngs, and the long mahogany bar lined with the men of the frontier. The place only recently closed as a moving picture theater, but one may be sure none of the dramas flashed on its screen equaled in thrilling interest the dramas of real life that once unfolded within these four walls. Bob Hatch's old billiard hall is still a billiard hall, and ivory balls click a daily requiem where Morgan Earp was killed. In the old Alhambra, a grocer fills the market baskets of housewives and suavely explains a rise in the price of onions. The post office occupies the site where once stood Martin Costello's saloon, where St. Louis beer was first sold in Tombstone. Mice play in the empty darkness of the Maison Dorée, where Julius Caesar served his delectable dishes. The Can-Can, run by a Chinaman, still flourishes as a popular eating house, where ham and eggs are seasoned with history. Johnny Montgomery's OK Corral is a garage. The Birdcage Theater is like a building that has died and been embalmed. It looks natural, as they say when they turn down the sheet, but its songs, its dancing, its merry doings, and its tipsy revelry, which were its life, have vanished. The famous old honky-tonk has become in these days of evil fortune a storehouse for odds and ends of old furniture. The stage is deep with dust, and the dingy boxes where queens of song boosted beer sales between arias look down on piles of rusty beds and broken tables. On one of the walls off stage, you may read these names scribbled in black paint by actors and actresses who in the long ago appeared in the glare of the Birdcage footlights. Amy Brandon, Ella Davis, Charles Keene, Manning Barthelard, Nick Williams, William Walker, Ada Grayson, Jesse Field, Jules Garrison, Eddie Moore, Irie Conley, Jenny Melville, Lily Melbourne, Tony Hewitt, Ollie Bingleford, Ida Grayson, Stella Elton, William Baker, Joe Fuete, Ella Gardner, Soldern and Dixon. These names may mean something to somebody, somewhere. Where the red lights used to twinkle is now a district of homes and pretty yards filled with trees and flowers, and in the midst of the residences rises the high school, Tombstone's most imposing building. Fremont Street is empty and silent. Near the City Hall, built in 1882, is the vacant lot where the Earps and Clantons met in battle, a pile of tin cans and rubbish, the only monument marking the historic spot. Toughnut is a residence street. Where the telegraph pole stood to which John Heath was hanged by the men of Bisbee is a cottage embowered in shrubbery and blooming plants. The old courthouse gives a touch of bustling animation to Toughnut Street when crowds of lawyers, clients, and witnesses gather in the county seat during sessions of court. Near the south end of the thoroughfare stands the one remaining lamp-post of Tombstone's early days, looking as if it had risen from the dead. Its rays once dimly illumined Nellie Cashman's boarding house, and around it formed the mob from whose fury Wyatt Earp saved Johnny behind the deuce. Near the old lamp-post is the cave-like aperture of the $1 million stope, so called because in this tunnel beneath the town the Grand Central Mine glory holed, taking out $840,000. The shaft caved in at this point in 1908, carrying down a horse and ice wagon. The wagon was demolished, but the horse was uninjured and was led out through an underground passage to the old mouth of the mine a quarter of a mile away. Most of the business part of town, it is said, is undermined and crisscrossed with old tunnels. The hill above the town is desolate. The last attempt to work the mines was made in 1901, when E.B. Gage merged all the properties in the Tombstone Consolidated Mines and installed pumps with a capacity of 8 million gallons a day. The company went into bankruptcy in 1911, having lost $5 million. At a receiver's sale in 1914, the Phelps Dodge interests, which own the Copper Queen in Bisbee, purchased the properties for $500,000. A little mining is still done by leasers. 40 of the mines are under lease to 35 individuals, and 110 men work in the shafts daily. 1,500 tons of ore a month are shipped to the Douglas smelters. The ore averages $8 or $9 in silver to the ton. The company furnishes power. The leasers pay the company 20% of the value of their ore. Their 80%, it is said, amounts to a little better than day wages. Ed Massey and Bill Williams, leasers, struck a pay streak in 1924 and took out $50,000 apiece. This is the only strike made on the hill since early days. The company, after paying taxes, perhaps breaks even. The Tombstone mines, experts declare, probably will never be worked again. You will find many people in Tombstone who have lived there 25, 30, and 35 years. Not a few were there during John Slaughter's terms as sheriff, but not more than 8 or 10 date back to the days of the Earps. A.C. Cummings is one of the oldest inhabitants, also the wealthiest. He owns many of the old landmarks, including the Birdcage Theater. Mrs. Martin Costello, now of Los Angeles, probably owns more Tombstone property than Mr. Cummings. What Mrs. Costello doesn't own, Mr. Cummings does, is the way the town folks put it. The famous figures in Tombstone's early history are, for the most part, dead. Sheriff Behan became superintendent of Yuma Prison and later special agent of the Department of the Treasury with headquarters at El Paso. He served in the quartermaster's department of the Army in Cuba during the Spanish War, then in the Philippines, and in China during the Boxer Rebellion. He died in Tucson in 1912. If you drop into the old Pueblo Club in Tucson, a liveried servitor will take your card and fade across soft carpets through portieres. When he ushers you into the luxurious lounge of the establishment, you will find a distinguished-looking gentleman, white of hair and mustache, fingering your card. This is Colonel William M. Breckenridge, known as Billy Breckenridge in days of happy-go-lucky adventuring among Curly Bill's outlaws. The colonel is in his 80s, hale, vigorous, and full of interesting talk of old times. If you should happen to miss him at his club, you will doubtless find him at the pleasant quarters of the Arizona Pioneers Historical Society, where the old-timers of the frontier foregather, and where strangers within the city gates are made welcome by E. L. Vale, president, and Mrs. Edith Kitt, custodian, with the courtesy and kindliness that are the essence of the old frontier's spirit of hospitality. Ike Clanton, who with boastful tongue swaggered among Tombstone's bars and whose running feet left indelible prints across Tombstone's early history, was killed in 1887 on Bonita Creek, 20 miles west of Montmorency. Deputy Sheriffs J.V. Brighton and George Powell, who held a warrant for his arrest, waited in hiding for him at his cabin. "Hands up!" was the last articulate sound the outlaw heard on earth. Yuma yawned for him. Liberty was sweet. He put spurs to his horse and fell dead with 2 bullets between his shoulder blades before he had gone 20 yards. Finn Clanton, last of the famous family, died in bed at his ranch near Miami after serving 10 years in prison for cattle stealing. Tales of the old wild days in Tombstone were heard in Boston at the recent trial of the Crabtree will case in the Suffolk Probate Court, and caused the prim blue-stocking city of the Puritan fathers to gasp in scandalized bewilderment. Lotta Crabtree, famous stage beauty, died in Boston without known heirs and left something like $4 million to charity. Mrs. Carlotta Crabtree Cockburn of San Gabriel, California, claiming to be a niece, sued for a share in the estate. According to the plaintiff's story, Jack Crabtree, only brother of Lotta, married Anne Leopold in San Francisco and lived with her in Tombstone in 1880 to 81. After the birth of a daughter, he deserted his wife and baby and joined his sister, in the management of whose theatrical affairs he had a hand until his death 5 years later. Soon after he disappeared, his wife levanted, it is said, with Jack Rabb, a gambler. Within a few years, she also died. Deserted by both parents, the little girl was adopted by Ed Bullock, a Tombstone liveryman and Jack Crabtree's most intimate friend. The girl grew up in Bullock's home in California, and at her marriage became Mrs. Cockburn. In seeking to invalidate Mrs. Cockburn's claims, lawyers for the Crabtree estate contended that Jack Crabtree and Anne Leopold were never married, and that Bullock was the child's father. Nothing in recent years had given Tombstone such a delicious morsel of scandal to roll over its tongue as this interesting case. Citizens divided into two factions. Whether Jack Crabtree and Anne Leopold were married and whether the baby was their child were questions which threatened to precipitate a vendetta in Tombstone society comparable in flaming intensity to the Earp-Clanton feud. Tombstone pioneers in many parts of the country gave depositions on one side or the other. Among these witnesses were Wyatt Earp, William Breckenridge, and Mrs. Alec Durwood, once the wife of buckskin Frank Leslie, John B. Wright, lawyer of Tucson, who has fought Mrs. Cockburn's battle from the first, went to court in Boston armed with 60 depositions from old Tombstone citizens in support of his client's claim. Mr. Wright, Arizona lawyer for 34 years, enlivened the Boston court proceedings with a frontier anecdote. "I was on a train bound for Tombstone," said Mr. Wright, "when it was boarded by 2 masked robbers. I was traveling with a deputy sheriff who wore 2 6-shooters. 'Are you a good shot?' I asked him in a whisper out of the corner of my mouth, as we stood in the aisle with our hands above our heads. 'No,' he replied emphatically. 'Then,' said I, 'for God's sake, don't shoot.' The robbers took our money and watches and the deputy sheriff's guns, but politely returned my office keys." The Boston court, in its decision, denied Mrs. Cockburn's claim. It held that Jack Crabtree and Anne Leopold had never been married, that their relations did not even constitute common law marriage, and that Mrs. Cockburn was not an heir and had no legal claim of any kind upon the Lotta Crabtree estate. Life goes pleasantly in Tombstone, if quietly. It is a sociable, hospitable little community. The women are forever entertaining. There are church affairs and women's club affairs and literary society affairs and amateur theatricals by the Drama League and concerts by the high school band. Roads about town are excellent. It is an easy, pleasant drive to Tucson, Benson, Bisbee, Douglas. Motor parties go frequently to Agua Prieta, Naco, and Nogales across the Mexican line, where they dine on enchiladas, tamales, and frijoles, and if the truth must be known, drink a few bottles of ice-cold beer. One drives in an hour to Naco, pleasant oasis of wetness. The Epitaph, as in old days, keeps Tombstone abreast of the times. It is a weekly now, published in a plant equipped with linotype machines and modern presses, and with its scareheads and typographical technique, it looks much like a big city newspaper. William H. Kelly, who edits it and manages its business affairs, is the grandson of George H. Kelly, state historian. He is a college-bred man and a trained journalist, and he gets out a lively and interesting paper. Tombstone has already elected Billy Kelly an alderman and promises to send him to Congress someday. The gossip and happenings of Tombstone, as recorded in the epitaph, are widely different from those of an earlier time. Mrs. William Lutley entertained at bridge last evening. Mrs. A.C. Cummings gave a delightful dinner. Mrs. Porter MacDonald's card party was an enjoyable affair. Mrs. A.H. Gardner read a paper before the Literary Society. Mrs. Ethel Massia was hostess at a dinner dance. Mr. and Mrs. J.D. Taylor returned from a visit to Warren. Judge and Mrs. Albert M. Sames are back from Douglas. C.J. Sheldon presided at the luncheon of the Businessmen's Club. Porter MacDonald spent yesterday in Naco, driving over in his new car. Bud Marr is making good in his new position as chief of police. Jeff Melton was in from Fairbank. A.M. Morris, superintendent of the Bunker Hill Mining Company, has been transferred to Montmorency. Greenway Albert has returned from California. J.T. Kingsbury and wife spent Sunday in Nogales. R.B. Krebs and J.A. Ivy and wife are visiting in Bisbee. Sheriff George Henshaw and Mayor Charles Schneider are back from Tucson. This sort of thing constitutes news in Tombstone nowadays. Allen Street, with its dilapidated old stores, looks a little forlorn in daylight, despite its asphalt and its automobiles, but when a coyote lifts a weird song in the mesquite, and the moon hangs over the dragoons, it is easy to imagine it the frontier boulevard it used to be. Then the disfiguring scars left by the years disappear, and the ancient buildings, bathed in the soft light as in a fountain of youth, seemed clothed in the strength and freshness of old days. The present fades, the past rises like a picture. There in the street are the lumber trains coming in from the Chiricahuas, the 16-mule ore teams with their clanking trace chains, the yells of mule skinners, the cracking of whips. The arcaded sidewalks are crowded. Swing doors of saloons flail back and forth. Laughter of roistering throngs comes from the brightly lighted bars. You hear the click of faro chips, the rattle of roulette wheels. The scent of spiced drinks and orange peel is in the air. That tall man there with the six-shooters buckled around him is Wyatt Earp. Doc Holliday is lounging in a doorway. Yonder are Virgil and Morgan Earp. Johnny Behan bustles along. And the Clantons and McLowrys and Buckskin Frank and John Ringo in his great buffalo coat, his hands rammed in his pockets on his guns. And Curly Bill and his bold buccaneers, riding in from the San Simon, go clattering past, when a coyote lifts a weird song in the mesquite, and the moon hangs over the dragoons. Tombstone flames no more. Its wild days are a tale that is told. It lives with its memories and its ghosts. Sunshine and peace are its portion. Once it was romance. Now it's a town. The end. End of Chapter 22. End of Tombstone, an Iliad of the Southwest, by Walter Noble Burns.